Hey there. Yes, you. Come on in and get comfortable. Pull that blanket up if you have one nearby, dim whatever light you can reach, and let whatever was pulling at your mind today just loosen its grip for a while. I'm glad you found your way back here tonight. Some evenings call for quiet company, and I hope this turns into exactly that for you. Because tonight we're not staying in the present. We're stepping back into a city that looked beautiful from a distance and was hiding something almost impossible to believe underneath. In the summer of 1858, the most powerful government on the face of the earth could not do its job. Not because of war, not because of rebellion, because of a smell so thick it soaked into curtains, into hair, into the collars of gentlemen's shirts. Lawmakers pressed handkerchiefs to their mouths inside their own chamber. And the strangest part of all, almost everyone in that room believed the smell itself could kill them. Before we walk into that summer together, let me ask you something small. If this is the kind of story you enjoy keeping company with at night, I would love it if you tapped that like button, left a comment, or subscribed so we could keep meeting like this. Only if you mean it, though. Only if it is something you actually look forward to. I go through every comment you leave, and I'm curious about one thing tonight. Where are you right now, tucked into bed already? Riding home in the dark, wide awake and just needing somewhere quiet to land? Tell me, I would love to know. Now go ahead. Turn the lights down low if you can. Let a fan hum somewhere nearby, just enough sound to make the room feel soft around you. And when you are ready, let's step into 1858. London in the middle of the 19th century was the largest city the world had ever seen. 2 million people called its streets home, all of them producing waste faster than the city had any real way to clear away. For a long time, this had not been much of a problem. Human waste went into cesspits dug beneath houses, and men called night soil collectors emptied those pits after dark, carting the contents out to farmland beyond the city walls. It was not pleasant work, but it held things together more or less. Smaller streams that once ran clear through parts of the city, little rivers with names like the Fleet, had already quietly turned into open channels for whatever people no longer wanted inside their homes. Then came a modern convenience that was supposed to fix everything: the flushing toilet. Wealthier homes rushed to install them. Water rushed in, waste rushed out. And nearly every one of those new pipes fed straight into London's old sewer system, a network originally built to carry rainwater, never designed to carry anything else. From there it all drained directly into the River Thames, the very same river that supplied much of the city's drinking water. Nobody meant for this to happen. It was progress dressed up as plumbing. But progress without understanding has a quiet way of building a disaster, one convenient flush at a time. For years the problem grew beneath the surface, easy to ignore because most of the city simply could not see it. Then came that summer. The heat in 1858 was brutal even by English standards, week after week without real rain. The Thames, already thick with decades of waste, began to bake under the sun like something left out in the open far too long. At low tide, the mudbanks sat exposed to the heat, and everything quietly hidden under water for years was suddenly out in the air for an entire city to breathe. People at the time described it as a physical wall of smell, something you could almost lean against. It crept through open windows, through the gaps beneath doors, into fabric, into food, into the hair of anyone brave enough to step outside. Those who had the money to leave simply left. Entire households packed up and travelled to the coast or the countryside for the season, treating the city itself as something to be escaped. Those without that kind of money stayed exactly where they were, in the same rooms, breathing the same thickened air day after day with nowhere else to go. For everyone who stayed, ordinary life turned into a quiet, constant negotiation with the air itself. People carried handkerchiefs soaked in vinegar and pressed them to their faces on the street. Some kept small bundles of dried herbs or orange peel tucked into a pocket, lifting them right up to the nose whenever the smell grew too strong to bear. None of it did much of anything, if we are honest. But when you believe the danger is floating past your face, you reach for whatever feels like protection, even a scrap of dried orange peel. And right in the middle of it all sat the newly rebuilt Houses of Parliament, perched on the riverbank, with nowhere at all to hide. Picture the scene for a moment, because it is almost funny in hindsight if it were not also so telling. Grown men, some of the most powerful lawmakers in the world, soaking curtains in chloride of lime and hanging them over the windows, hoping fabric and chemicals could hold back a smell that had already conquered an entire city. Members walked out of debates mid-sentence, covering their faces, some of them physically sick. One account even claims a committee touring the riverside had to turn back entirely driven away by the stench alone before they finished their work. Now here is where the story turns from simply unpleasant into something far more human. That smell had been sitting on London's doorstep for years already. The families packed into cramped housing nearest the water, the poorest of the city, had been breathing this same air every summer, long before Parliament ever noticed. Nobody with any real power had rushed to fix it for them. Somewhere in one of those riverside rooms there was very likely a mother pressing a damp cloth to a feverish child's forehead, refusing to open the window even in that unbearable heat, because everything she had ever been taught told her that opening it might let sickness itself come pouring in. It took the smell finally reaching Parliament, reaching the very people with the authority to act before anything moved with any real speed at all. That is not some modern observation about privilege dressed up for effect. That is simply what happened. To understand why nobody acted sooner, you have to understand what people at the time truly believed was making them sick. This was the age of something called the miasma theory, the belief that disease itself travelled through foul-smelling air. Not water, not anything invisible to the nose. If a place smelled terrible, doctors reasoned it must be dangerous. If it smelled clean, you were probably safe. It sounds almost sweet in its simplicity now, does it not? A world where you could judge your own safety just by breathing in through your nose. But that belief had already gotten real people killed. London had suffered several outbreaks of cholera in the years leading up to the Great Stink, and each time physicians pointed to the smell in the air as the culprit, never once suspecting the water flowing quietly out of the very same pumps everyone drank from every day. One writer of the period joked half seriously that a single glass of London water probably held more tiny swimming creatures than there were people on the whole planet. People laughed at that line, and then went right on drinking the water anyway, because what other choice did they truly have? There was one physician, a quiet, methodical man named John Snow, who had already begun questioning all of this a few years earlier during an outbreak in Soho. He did something almost nobody else thought to try. He walked from door to door. He marked every case of cholera on a map by hand one at a time, and slowly a pattern began to surface. Case after case circled back to the very same water pump on Broad Street. Not the air surrounding it, the water coming out of it. Snow suspected correctly that something inside the water itself was spreading the disease, years before anyone could actually see a germ under a microscope and prove it. There was even a small strange detail buried inside his research that I have always found quietly funny. A brewery sitting right in the middle of the outbreak barely lost a single worker, while neighbours on every side around it fell sick. It turned out the brewery workers rarely touched the pump water at all. They drank their daily allowance of beer instead, and in this one particular case that habit may have quietly kept them safe. Snow convinced local officials to remove the handle from the Broad Street pump, and the outbreak slowed almost right away. And still almost nobody believed him. That is the part of this story that stays with me the most. The right answer was already sitting quietly on a hand-drawn map, largely dismissed by the medical world, while an entire government scrambled to fight a smell instead of a cause. Sometimes the truth arrives early, and simply is not ready to be believed yet. So when the Great Stink finally choked the halls of power in 1858, the government's first instinct was not to ask what was actually inside the water. It was to mask the smell. Officials dumped enormous amounts of lime chloride straight into the river, hoping to chemically smother the odour. It barely worked, and in some stretches of the river, it may have made the water even more dangerous than before. But something good did come out of that miserable summer, and it came fast. A young politician named Benjamin Disraeli pushed a bill through Parliament calling for a completely new sewer system for the entire city. And it passed in just 18 days. 18 days from a government famous for moving at the pace of a horse-drawn carriage stuck in mud. That alone should tell you how badly they wanted that smell gone. The task of actually building a solution fell to an engineer named Joseph Bazalgette, and what he built still runs beneath London to this day. Hundreds of miles of brick sewer tunnels carrying waste far away from both the river and the water. People drank all of it, eventually gathered at enormous pumping stations with names like Abbey Mills and Crossness buildings, so ornately decorated with iron and brick that some people at the time called them cathedrals of sewage. Along the way, Bazalgette also built the grand stone embankments that now line the Thames-wide riverside walkways that tourists stroll along today without ever knowing what those walkways were truly built to hide beneath their feet, or that tunnels for the city's earliest underground railway were tucked in right alongside them. Here is the part that still gives me a strange kind of chill whenever I think about it. Bazalgette was not trying to stop germs. Nobody involved in building that sewer system understood germ theory the way we do today. He was simply trying to get rid of a smell and to satisfy a theory about bad air that we now know was wrong from the start. But by moving that waste away from London's drinking water, he accidentally did exactly the right thing anyway. Cholera outbreaks across the city dropped sharply in the years that followed. An entire city was made safer, not because anyone fully understood why yet, but because one very stubborn engineer built something so thorough, it worked regardless of the theory behind it. Sometimes people arrive at the right answer while still believing the wrong reason for it. There is something almost comforting in that thought, is there not? It means progress does not always wait for perfect understanding. Sometimes it only needs enough discomfort, enough smell in the air, and one person determined enough to keep digging. And John Snow, the quiet physician with his hand-drawn map, would not see the medical world fully agree with him in his own lifetime. It took years and the slow rise of an entirely different idea called germ theory before doctors finally accepted what his map had already shown all along. History is full of people who were right early and simply had to wait for everyone else to catch up. But here is what the short version of this story never tells you. That fear of invisible danger in the air, that instinct to distrust anything you could not see or smell, did not stay locked inside the walls of Parliament. It followed ordinary people home. It crept into their kitchens, their bedrooms, and strangest of all, into the very water they poured over their own skin. Because if the air outside could kill with nothing more than a bad smell, then what exactly were people willing to believe about a warm bath? That is where we are headed next. So let's actually sit with that question for a moment, because the truth behind it is stranger than the smell itself ever was. If you had walked into a physician's office in London around 1860 and asked whether a daily bath was a good idea, quite a few doctors would have looked back at you with real concern, the same way a modern doctor might look at you for admitting to a pack of cigarettes a day. Not because you seemed unclean, but because you wanted to wash so often. Many physicians of the period sincerely believed that frequent bathing stripped the skin of something. They called its natural protective oil, leaving a person weaker, colder, and strangely more open to sickness. It is almost funny how closely this echoes everything we just talked about with the air outside. The same instinct that made a government soak curtains in chemicals to block a smell also convinced doctors that water itself, something we now consider one of the most basic tools of good health, might quietly be an enemy. If you could not trust the air moving through your own street, why would you trust the water sitting in your own basin? Now be honest with me for 1 second. How many nights this week did you tell yourself a shower could wait until morning? No judgment here truly. As it turns out, an entire century of British men and women would have agreed with you completely, just for very different reasons. Because here is what people often get wrong about this era. Victorians were not walking around covered in dirt from head to toe. What counted as clean simply looked different from what we expect today. In most households, a daily wash meant something far more targeted. The face, the neck, the feet, the underarms, and whatever areas were considered most essential, all cleaned with a basin, a cloth, and a bit of cold water. A full bath where the entire body sank into water at once was treated as something closer to a medical event than a daily habit, and like any medical event of the period, it often came with its own set of rules about timing temperature and how long a person was permitted to stay in. For families who could manage a full bath at all, it usually happened once a week, often on a Saturday night in preparation for church the next morning. And in many homes, one single tub of hot water served the entire household. The father bathed first since heating. That much water took real effort and nobody wanted to waste it. Then came the mother. Then one by one the children from oldest to youngest. By the time the smallest baby finally got a turn, that water had already washed half the family and had gone noticeably grey and cold in the process. There is a saying that survives from exactly this custom, one you've almost certainly heard without knowing where it came from. Do not throw the baby out with the bath water. It sounds like nonsense until you picture that murky tub and a mother checking twice before she poured it away, just to be sure nothing small was still hiding in there. Part of this ritual came down to sheer effort rather than belief. Water had to be hauled from a well, or a pump heated over a fire, then carried up narrow stairs, often by a servant if the household could afford one. A single bath could take the better part of an hour just to prepare before anyone had even stepped into the tub. When something takes that much work, it stops being a daily habit and becomes something closer to an occasion. For a child in one of these households, that Saturday ritual carried its own particular mix of feelings, part excitement, part dread, depending on how many older siblings had already taken their turn in the water before you. Grown men and women who had lived through it later remembered the evening less as a comfort and more as an inspection. Hair scrubbed a little too hard, ears checked a little too closely and afterward buttoned into a clean nightshirt, whether sleep was anywhere near your mind or not. And if a weekly tub sounds modest to you, some Victorians took the whole idea of bathing in the entirely opposite direction, treating water not as a danger to avoid, but as a medicine to be measured out in careful doses. Across the countryside, a whole industry grew up around what doctors of the time called hydropathy, or simply the water cure. Wealthy patients travelled to spa towns such as Malvern, checking themselves into clinics run by physicians who sincerely believed that cold water applied in very specific and often uncomfortable ways could treat almost anything that troubled the body. Take the naturalist Charles Darwin, who arrived at one such clinic in 1849, worn down by years of a mysterious stomach illness that no ordinary doctor had managed to explain. His daily treatment, prescribed by a physician named Dr. James Gully, sounds less like medicine and more like something out of an endurance trial. He was heated over a small spirit lamp until he was dripping with sweat, then rubbed down hard with towels soaked in cold water, followed by 2 cold foot baths, and a damp compress worn across his stomach for most of the day. Darwin, somewhat to his own surprise, wrote to a friend that he believed the water cure was no quackery at all. His symptoms did seem to improve at least for a while. He was not the only well-known name to make that same journey to Malvern. The nurse Florence Nightingale returned to the town again and again. So did the writer Charles Dickens and the poet Alfred Tennyson. Meanwhile, plenty of respected physicians back in London dismissed the entire practice as nonsense dressed up in scientific language. It is a strange thing to sit with if you think about it long enough. The same decade, the same country, the same plain substance, and two completely opposite convictions about what water could do to a human body. One camp avoided it as a danger. Another camp paid enormous sums of money to be half drowned in it on purpose, and the doctors running the most fashionable of these water cure clinics, worth noting, tended to do extremely well for themselves financially, which is a gentle reminder that uncertainty, when delivered with enough confidence, has always had a way of turning a profit. This same conviction that water could build strength rather than steal it away did not stop with grown adults chasing a cure. It reached straight into the nursery, particularly where boys were concerned. Many boarding schools of the period expected every boy to step into a bath of cold water each morning, no matter the season, well before breakfast. This was never framed as punishment. It was framed as character. An entire philosophy took hold at the time, sometimes remembered today as muscular Christianity, linking physical toughness directly to moral goodness. A boy who could stand a cold bath without a single complaint was, in the thinking of that era, quietly proving something about the kind of man he was destined to become. Mothers back home opening letters describing chattering teeth and stiff reddened fingers were expected to feel a certain pride rather than alarm. But if bathing the body was treated with this much caution, and occasionally this much extremity, what happened on top of a woman's head was treated with something closer to reverence. A woman's hair in this period was often described as her crowning glory, and that phrase was not just poetic decoration. Long, thick, healthy hair was considered one of the clearest outward signs of good health and good breeding a woman could display, even though it spent most of each day pinned up and hidden beneath a hat, only let down in private for a husband to see. Because of that, hair washing was treated as a serious and fairly rare event. Some women washed their hair only once a month, and beauty guides from the era occasionally suggested that even those with oily hair should not wash more than once every 2 weeks. Can you imagine going an entire month between hair washes? Some of you are probably already calculating in your head whether you could survive that. When wash day did finally arrive, shampoo as we know it did not exist yet. Instead, women reached for whatever the kitchen had to offer. Eggs cracked directly onto the scalp and worked through to the ends. Vinegar stirred into water. Cold black tea or rosemary steeped like a small pot of medicine, or occasionally a splash of rum all rubbed in and rinsed out by hand. There is something quietly charming about that image, if you ask me. A woman standing over a basin with an egg in her hair, using the exact same ingredients sitting in her own pantry for breakfast to build the reputation of good breeding. Everyone around her was so eager to judge. That same suspicion toward untreated water followed people well beyond their own homes. Etiquette and health guides of the period actually warned travellers against washing their face in unfamiliar water at all, unless it had first been treated with a splash of alcohol or ammonia. The worry was not really about dirt. It was about whatever invisible danger might be hiding inside water nobody in the household had tested or trusted before. One popular beauty routine from the period, sometimes called a Russian bath, involved washing the face first in extremely hot water and immediately afterward in extremely cold water, back and forth, all in the name of preventing wrinkles. If that sounds familiar to anyone who has watched a wellness influencer plunge their face into a bowl of ice water this year, you're not imagining the connection. We like to think of ourselves as far more advanced than the Victorians, and then every so often we invent the exact same routine, film it, and give it a brand new name. Attitudes did shift as the decades wore on, though. By the later years of Victoria's reign, an entirely different kind of bathing had become fashionable among those who could afford it, known as the Turkish bath. Modelled loosely on bathhouses from the Ottoman world, these public bathhouses invited guests to sweat freely in a series of increasingly hot, dry rooms, followed by a full wash and massage, then a plunge into cold water, and finally a long, quiet rest in a cooling room. What is worth noticing here is not just the routine itself, but what it reveals. The very same culture that once treated bathing as a health risk had within a few decades turned it into a luxury people paid good money to enjoy. Fear and fashion. It turns out can trade places surprisingly fast, especially once bathing became something respectable. People were seen doing in public, rather than something whispered about behind closed doors, and at home the tub itself was quietly changing too. Toward the end of the century, the grandest houses began installing proper porcelain bathtubs, plumbed directly into both hot and cold water, sparing a servant from ever having to carry another bucket up the stairs. Some of these homes even included a small plumbed basin built for one purpose alone, washing the feet, essentially an entire miniature bathtub whose only job in life was 10 toes. If you had told a household from earlier in the century that their grandchildren would one day own a separate tub just for feet, they likely would have laughed you out of the room. Owning a proper bathroom by this point had quietly become less about health at all, and much more about announcing to every visitor who walked past that door exactly how much money your family had. And speaking of being seen, nowhere did Victorian anxiety about water tangle with Victorian anxiety about modesty quite like it did at the seaside. Doctors had been recommending sea bathing as a treatment for various ailments since long before Victoria's reign even began, and by this point an entire seaside industry had grown up around that original prescription, complete with promenades, piers and boarding houses built purely to catch the sea air. Resorts introduced small wooden huts on wheels called bathing machines. A guest would change into a bathing costume inside one of these huts, and a horse would pull the entire structure down into the shallow water, so a person could step directly from the hut into the sea without ever being spotted crossing open sand. Can you picture it? Getting dressed inside a wooden shed while a horse slowly drags you toward the waves, also nobody catches a glimpse of you before you are safely underwater. Men and women were expected to use machines kept a considerable distance apart, with certain stretches of beach quietly reserved for one sex or the other. Guidebooks for respectable families were careful to specify exactly which hours and which stretch of sand belonged to whom, and yet newspapers of the day still found reasons to complain summer after summer that men and women kept drifting too near one another in the water anyway, almost as if the tide itself refused to respect Victorian boundaries. Looking back at all of this, what strikes me is not that Victorians got hygiene wrong. It is how confidently they got it wrong, dressed up in the full authority of medicine and etiquette guides, while ordinary people quietly followed along, because who were they to question a doctor or a magazine or a mother who had grown up doing things exactly this way? We like to imagine we've moved far past that kind of blind trust. Some days I am not entirely sure we have. We have simply chosen different experts and different magazines and hope we're trusting them more wisely than they did. Give it another 100 years and someone kinder than us, or maybe just more informed, will probably look back at a few of our own habits with that exact same gentle disbelief. But everything I've described so far, the tin tub, the egg rinsed through soft hair, the little wooden hut pulled by a patient horse, the porcelain basin built for nothing but 10 toes, all of it assumed one thing that was never true for everyone. It assumed a person actually had the water, the time and the privacy to make these choices in the first place. Bathing, whether people feared it or chased it as a cure, was still fundamentally a choice, and choice itself was a luxury. For a very large share of Victorian England, none of that was true at all, and the label history gave to those people, the ones without a tub, without spare water to heat, without so much as a door that shut behind them, was not a kind one. That label was not just an idea floating in the air. It had an actual name, one that has quietly survived all the way into modern English, even if most people who use it today have no idea where it came from. The Great Unwashed. You have probably heard someone use that phrase before, maybe as a joke about crowded festivals or busy holiday traffic. But the person who first put those words on paper in 1830 was a novelist named Edward Bulwer-Lytton. And here is the detail that always catches me off guard every time I think about it. In his original story, the phrase was not even aimed at people who were dirty. It was thrown as an insult at a man who was mocked by criminals in the story, specifically because he did bathe and did keep himself clean. Being clean in that scene was treated as strange, almost suspicious something that set a man apart from his own community, rather than something admirable. Somewhere along the way the meaning flipped entirely, and the phrase settled onto the poor instead as a permanent sneering label for anyone without the means to wash. And once a label like that exists, people stop asking why it might be true, and simply start repeating it as though it always was. Have you ever noticed how quickly that happens with any group of people in any century? Someone coins a clever cutting phrase, and within a generation nobody remembers it was ever an opinion instead of a fact. So let's actually ask why, because the real answer has very little to do with laziness and everything to do with plumbing pennies, and one very specific, very tired mother of two in Liverpool who nobody had ever heard of. Picture for a moment what it actually meant to keep clean if you had no money at all. Most working families in industrial cities did not have their own water supply inside the home. Water came from a shared standpipe out in a courtyard, sometimes serving as few as 3 houses in a decent neighbourhood, and as many as 20 houses crammed together in a poorer one, and that standpipe was not simply left running. Water companies typically turned the supply on for only a handful of hours a day, sometimes only every other day, which meant every household needed to be standing there pail in hand the moment the water started flowing, or risk going without until the next turn. Neighbours gathered at these standpipes, the way people gather at a well in an old story, except there was nothing peaceful about it. Witnesses at the time described actual queuing and shoving, entire streets worth of people competing for the same few hours of water, trying to fill every tub bowl and bucket they owned before the supply cut off again, carrying that water indoors, heating it over a fire that also had to cook every meal for the day, then somehow finding a private moment and a private space to actually wash. None of that came easily, or cheaply, or quickly. Cleanliness was never simply a matter of wanting to be clean. It was a matter of time nobody had water, nobody controlled, and fuel nobody could spare. Now here is where I want to tell you about a woman named Kitty Wilkinson, because if this story has a quiet hero buried inside it, it is her. Kitty was born in Ireland in the year 1786, and her childhood began with tragedy before she'd even properly settled into a new life. Her family crossed the water to Liverpool when she was still a young child, hoping for something better, and the ship carrying them ran aground on the way. Her father and her younger sister both drowned that day. By the age of 12, Kitty was already working inside a cotton mill in Lancashire, one of countless children whose small hands were considered useful on a factory floor. She eventually returned to Liverpool, went into domestic service alongside her mother, married, and settled into the kind of ordinary, difficult working-class life that history rarely bothers to record, until 1832 when cholera swept through the city. Fear moves fast through a crowded street. Families were losing people within a single day of falling ill, and nobody yet understood exactly why only that dirty bedding and unwashed clothing seemed to make everything worse. Kitty and her husband happened to own something. Almost nobody else on their street had a boiler capable of heating water in real quantity. As their neighbours fell sick around them, Kitty made a decision that seems almost obvious now, and was anything but obvious at the time. She opened her own cellar to the entire neighbourhood, inviting families to bring their bedding and their clothing to be boiled clean, using chloride of lime to help kill whatever was spreading the disease between households. She charged a single penny a week, just enough to cover the coal and the water, and she personally taught her neighbours how to do it properly, standing over steaming tubs in her own cellar, day after day, while an epidemic worked its way through the streets outside. Nobody had asked her to do this. There was no authority instructing her, no medical committee, no government office. A working-class woman with no formal education in the middle of an epidemic that was killing her neighbours simply looked at what she had and offered every bit of it to the people around her. Word of what she was doing eventually reached a local charitable group and a well-known Liverpool merchant named William Rathbone, both of whom stepped in to support her. A decade later, in 1842, their combined effort helped open something Britain had never had before: a proper public washhouse, and baths built specifically so the poor could keep themselves and their clothing clean without needing a private tub, a private boiler, or a private fortune. Kitty became its superintendent, a role she kept for years afterward. Years later, she was even given a silver teapot as thanks sent on behalf of Queen Victoria herself. And if you ever find yourself standing inside St George's Hall in Liverpool today, look around carefully. Among all the statues of politicians and generals lining that grand hall, there is now finally one statue of a woman. It belongs to Kitty, unveiled only in the last few years, more than a century and a half after she first opened her cellar door to a frightened, sick street. I think about her often when this part of the story comes up, because it would have been so easy for Kitty Wilkinson to simply survive her own circumstances and nothing more. Instead, at the exact moment fear could have made everyone shut their doors and protect only their own family, she opened hers wider. If you ask me, that is worth remembering just as much as any king or engineer in this entire story. What Kitty started in one cellar eventually became policy. In 1846, Parliament passed an act encouraging towns across the country to build their own public baths and washhouses funded through local taxes, and people came. When one new bathhouse opened its doors in the city of Coventry in 1852, more than 1,000 bathers reportedly showed up on the very first day alone. A warm bath typically cost around 2 pennies a cold one, closer to a single penny, cheap enough that a labouring family could actually manage it at least occasionally. These buildings usually had entirely separate entrances and separate hours set aside for men and women, and alongside the bathing rooms sat long rows of washing stalls, because for most working women getting the family's clothing and bedding properly clean mattered every bit as much as getting themselves clean. Step inside one of these washhouses on a busy morning, and you would have found the air thick with steam, the clatter of wooden paddles against tin tubs, voices calling back and forth over the noise, and rows of women elbow deep in soapy water, working side by side on the exact same chore their own mothers had once done by hand in a cramped kitchen. An entire morning could disappear into scrubbing, wringing, and hanging laundry at one of these communal washhouses, a chore so exhausting and so universally dreaded that entire households built their whole week around it, usually landing on the very same day, so that laundry day itself earned its own grim little nickname among the women who dreaded it most. But here is the part that always makes me raise an eyebrow a little. Even inside these charitable public baths built specifically to serve the poor, the class system found a way to sneak back in through the side door. Most of these buildings offered tiered pricing, a plain basic bath for the lowest fee, and a more comfortable private option. A little further up, sometimes including small comforts like a chair, a mirror, or a proper towel for those willing to pay a bit more. It seems nobody involved could quite resist the temptation to sort even the poor into their own smaller hierarchy of poor and slightly less poor. Even in a building built entirely around the idea of equal access to cleanliness, somebody still found a way to sell you a slightly nicer version of clean. Now be honest with me for a second. Doesn't that sound a little too familiar even today? There was another barrier standing in the way of the poor one that had nothing to do with water at all, and everything to do with the government. For more than 100 years, soap itself was taxed in Britain, treated by the Treasury almost like a luxury good alongside things like wig powder and playing cards. The tax pushed the price of ordinary soap high enough that smuggling networks actually grew up around it, quietly moving untaxed soap the same way other smugglers might move brandy or tea. Some soap makers gave up on the country entirely, packing up their workshops and moving across the water to Ireland, where the same tax did not apply. Manufacturers who stayed were required to work under the direct watch of excise officers stationed inside their own soap works, just to make sure nobody was making an unlicensed bar of the stuff. It was not until 1853, under a chancellor named William Gladstone, that the soap tax was finally scrapped completely. Think about that for a moment. For generation after generation, the very substance people needed most to answer the era's obsession with cleanliness had been priced artificially out of reach by the government itself. There is something almost bitterly funny about that once you sit with it. An entire century spent lecturing the poor about dirt and disease while quietly taxing the one product that might have actually helped. And the irony reaches even further into people's own homes. Think back to the servants we talked about earlier, the ones hauling bucket after bucket of hot water up narrow staircases so their employers could enjoy a proper weekly bath. Those same servants working below stairs in cramped, damp quarters often had access to nothing more than a shared basin and cold water for themselves, and precious little privacy or time to use even that. A housemaid might spend an entire evening preparing a steaming bath for her mistress, carrying jug after jug up flight after flight of stairs, only to wash her own face and hands afterward from whatever cold water happened to be left standing in the scullery. The people most responsible for keeping wealthy households clean were frequently the least able to keep themselves clean in return. It is a strange kind of quiet unfairness tucked away behind every polished staircase in every grand house of the period, the sort of detail that never once made it into a painting or a novel about the elegant side of the era. For factory workers, there was yet another obstacle that had nothing to do with willingness at all, the air itself. In industrial cities thick with coal smoke soot settled onto everything. Clothing skin windowsills, laundry hung out to dry, even the inside of a cupboard if you left the door open too long. A worker could scrub themselves raw at the end of a shift and still walk home through streets coating them in fresh grime before they even reach their own front door, undoing an hour of washing in the length of a single walk home. Judging someone as dirty in a city like that was a little like judging a fish for being wet. And yet plenty of Victorian commentators did exactly that, writing pamphlets and giving speeches about the moral failings of the working class as though a person's soul could be judged straight off the colour of their collar. So when wealthier Victorians looked at the poor and muttered about the great unwashed, what they were often really looking at was a system they themselves had helped build. Cramped housing with no private water, a soap tax that made basic cleaning supplies a luxury, jobs that covered a person in industrial filth faster than any bath could undo it, and then on top of all of that a label handed down with a curled lip, as if the dirt itself were a personal failing rather than the entirely predictable result of everything stacked against these families from the very start. I do not say this to lecture you, only to notice it out loud, because history has a funny habit of doing this again and again. We judge the outcome and quietly forget to ask about everything that shaped it. It is worth wondering honestly how many labels we still hand out today without ever asking the same question. What I find almost hopeful, though, is that the very same era capable of producing a phrase as cruel as the Great Unwashed also produced a woman like Kitty Wilkinson, quietly proving the entire premise wrong with nothing more than a borrowed boiler and a spare afternoon. Nobody gave her permission. Nobody paid her to care. She simply looked at her own street, decided the suffering there was not acceptable, and did something about it with whatever she happened to have on hand. If there is a single figure in this whole tangled story of Victorian hygiene worth quietly admiring, without any complications at all, my vote goes to her. But not every Victorian was fighting to make cleanliness more available. For some, cleanliness had already stopped being enough. Once you already have the water, the soap, the servants, and the private tub waiting upstairs being merely clean stops feeling like an achievement at all, it becomes the bare minimum the starting line rather than the finish. And for a certain kind of wealthy Victorian woman, the real competition had shifted somewhere else, entirely away from the body altogether and onto a single unforgiving surface, her own face, and just how perfectly pale, smooth, and flawless she could make it appear to every single person watching her walk into a room. Let's stay with that face for a moment, because it turns out an entire hidden economy grew up around the question of what a fashionable Victorian woman was supposed to look like, and almost none of it was safe. Here is the standard she was chasing. Pale skin, the paler the better, with no hint of a suntan, no visible muscle, no flush of colour that might suggest a life spent working outdoors. In this era, that particular shade of white was understood by everyone around you as a walking advertisement for virtue. It said quietly but unmistakably that you had never needed to labour in the sun a single day in your life. Respectable women went to real lengths to protect that paleness, carrying parasols on the sunniest days, pulling on gloves before stepping outside, sometimes even wearing veils simply to walk down the street. Meanwhile, obvious makeup, anything applied heavily enough for a stranger to notice, carried the opposite message entirely. It was considered the mark of actresses and women of the street, not respectable ladies. So an entire generation of Victorian women found themselves chasing something almost impossible. Skin so flawlessly pale it looked untouched, achieved through methods that were anything but natural. Now be honest with me for a second. Have you ever bought a skincare product mostly because of what the label promised without checking too closely what was actually inside the bottle? If so, you already understand exactly how an entire industry of poison managed to thrive for decades in plain sight. Take the arsenic wafer, small white roughly the size of a mint and sold quite openly through mail-order catalogues and local pharmacies under names such as Dr. Campbell's Safe Arsenic Complexion Wafers. The word arsenic sat right there on the label in plain print alongside a promise that the product was, and I am not exaggerating this phrasing, absolutely safe and harmless to anybody. Women nibbled on these wafers the way you might nibble on a mint after dinner, hoping to melt away freckles, blemishes, and any hint of a suntan. What the wafers actually did was slowly poison the body, killing off red blood cells and starving the skin of oxygen, which did indeed produce a certain pale, almost translucent look. It also caused nerve damage, kidney damage, hair loss, and strange dark growths on the hands and feet. Some historians even suspect this particular poison played a quiet role in all that fashionable fainting we associate with the era, alongside the tight corsets we'll get to eventually. None of this advice lived only in whispers between friends either, a widely circulated beauty manual from the period bearing the almost apologetic title of The Ugly Girl Papers, walked its readers through recipe after recipe for achieving a flawless face, casually mixing in mercury and other harsh chemicals, right alongside more harmless advice about diet and posture. It was printed and sold like any other household guide sitting on a shelf next to cookbooks and etiquette manuals, offering poison in exactly the same calm, matter-of-fact tone you might use to explain how to set a proper table. Where did the whole trend even begin? Interestingly enough, not in England at all, but in a mountainous region of Austria called Styria, where a local custom of eating small amounts of arsenic, sometimes starting as young as 15, was said to produce robust health and a strikingly smooth complexion. English and American writers picked up the story, dressed it in a bit of foreign mystery, and within a few years arsenic had travelled from a regional folk custom into medicine cabinets across 2 continents. It is worth noticing too just how lopsided this entire burden was. A Victorian gentleman was rarely expected to whiten his skin, paint his lips, or risk his eyesight chasing a fashionable stare. The occasional dandy might powder his face for the stage or a costume ball, but for most men, appearance simply was not treated as a battlefield the way it was for their wives, sisters and daughters. The poison in this story, almost without exception, was aimed squarely at women, sold to women and quietly killing women, while the men around them mostly stood by admiring the results without ever once being asked to risk the same, and arsenic was only the beginning. If a woman wanted something more dramatic than pale, something closer to porcelain, she turned to a heavier, older trick, entirely painting the face with a thick paste made largely of white lead. This process, sometimes called enamelling, could leave a woman's complexion looking smooth and doll-like for weeks at a time. It also came with a very specific social instruction attached: do not smile too widely, and try not to show too much emotion, because the paint had a tendency to crack right along the natural lines of the face the moment real expression pushed against it. Picture that for a second. An entire fashionable evening spent smiling carefully, laughing quietly, keeping your face as still as a painted portrait. Also, the actual paint covering your skin would not visibly split apart in front of your guests. Underneath that paste, lead was doing exactly what lead always does inside a human body. It built up slowly in the bloodstream, and over months or years it caused skin discoloration, hair loss, and damage to the nervous system. Some women who relied on it for years developed a greyish, almost sickly undertone to their skin that no amount of fresh paste could quite disguise. Any more, an irony so cruel it barely needs pointing out, the very treatment meant to preserve youthful glowing skin slowly stole the glow it promised, one layer at a time. And here is the part that always strikes me as particularly cruel about this whole cycle. Once lead started damaging the skin underneath, women often responded by applying an even thicker layer of the very same paste to hide the new blemishes it had caused, which only pushed more lead into the body, which caused more damage, which called for an even thicker layer the next time. It is one of the more quietly devastating loops in this entire story. A beauty routine that was quite literally eating away at the thing it promised to perfect. Meanwhile, if a woman wanted a flush of pink in her cheeks or a deep rosy tint on her lips, one popular option was a pigment called vermilion made from a compound of mercury. Mercury found its way into a startling number of Victorian beauty routines. One widely sold skin cream launched in the 1880s and stayed on shelves containing mercury for decades, afterward marketed the entire time as a gentle, soothing treatment for delicate complexions. In the 1870s, a well-known American fashion magazine even printed advice recommending a mercury-based ointment be rubbed directly onto the eyelids to encourage thicker, longer lashes. Can we just sit with that for a second? If that sounds oddly familiar to anyone currently using an eyelash growth serum, you're not wrong to notice the echo. We like to imagine ourselves as endlessly more careful than the Victorians, and then every so often one of our own beauty aisles quietly proves us wrong. What do you think future generations will say about something sitting in your own bathroom cabinet right now? There was also belladonna dropped straight into the eyes to widen the pupils into that fashionable doll-like stare so many portraits from the period seem to share. It worked in the sense that it did dilate the eyes beautifully. It also carried a real risk of permanent vision damage with repeated use, a price plenty of women were apparently willing to gamble against for the sake of a look, and poison was not confined to the face at all. The most fashionable shade of green available to Victorian dressmakers, a brilliant, almost electric colour used in fabric, in artificial flowers, and in wallpaper covering the walls of countless respectable homes, was created using an arsenic-based pigment. Tests conducted later in the century on dress fabric found some samples carrying more than enough arsenic spread across a single gown to cause real harm to the person wearing it and to anyone standing near enough to breathe in the dust it shed as the fabric moved and wore down over an evening of dancing. A woman could avoid every wafer and every jar of paint in this entire story, and still quite innocently be wearing her own poison to the bull. Now, of everyone who tried to profit from this particular obsession, one woman deserves her own place in this story, because her rise and her fall could not have been more dramatic if a novelist had invented her. Her name, at least the name she gave the fashionable women of London, was Madame Rachel. She was born into genuine poverty in the East End of London sometime in the early years of the century, and as a girl she survived by selling whatever she could carry: rabbit skins, dried fish, second-hand clothing pulled from door to door. There was nothing glamorous about where she started, and yet sometime in the 1860s this same woman opened an extraordinary shop on fashionable New Bond Street, above the door of which she had painted a single unforgettable promise: beautiful forever. Inside, Madame Rachel sold cosmetics with names dripping in invented exoticism. A face cream said to be imported from Arabia at enormous personal expense. A wrinkle remedy called the magnetic rock dew of the Sahara, supposedly carried across the desert by swift camel. She told her wealthy, gullible clientele that these treasures had reached her under special license from foreign royalty, and she charged prices to match the fantasy, sometimes the equivalent of a small fortune for a single jar. What was actually inside those jars once investigators finally looked ordinary bran, starch, fuller's earth, hydrochloric acid, and running through several of her more dramatic treatments, the very same white lead and arsenic already poisoning half of fashionable London through entirely legitimate shops. Her most notorious service, the enamelling of a client's face and even her exposed shoulders and chest, used exactly the toxic paste we just described, sold to desperate women at a staggering markup wrapped in a story about Arabian princesses. Madame Rachel understood something about marketing that plenty of modern advertisers would still recognize today. She published her own book, sold exclusively through her own shop, promising eternal youth to anyone who followed her regimen faithfully. She dressed her own daughters up as walking proof of her methods, presenting them to curious visitors as being years older than their true age, living evidence that her creams could hold back time itself. Uneducated herself, unable even to sign her own name when she began this whole enterprise, she nonetheless built something that fooled duchesses, wealthy widows and society wives for the better part of a decade. But cosmetics alone did not make Madame Rachel wealthy. Blackmail did. Many of her clients were married women with no legal access to their own money, quietly running up enormous debts at her shop that they could never explain to a husband. Madame Rachel would offer ever so helpfully to accept jewellery as security against those debts, and then used the looming threat of exposure of a husband discovering both the debt and the secret to squeeze every last coin she could from women too frightened to refuse. It eventually caught up with her. In 1868, one client, a widow who had poured a small fortune into Madame Rachel's promises, finally found the courage to go to the authorities, and Madame Rachel stood trial at London's Central Criminal Court. Newspapers covered every detail with an almost gleeful cruelty, some of it dressed up as legitimate reporting, and some of it simply ugly prejudice, aimed at her Jewish background with cartoonists sharpening every unkind stereotype they could reach for. One newspaper alone reportedly published dozens of separate articles chasing the scandal across its 4 days in court. The first trial ended without a clear verdict. The second did not. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison, of which she served 3. Astonishingly, once released, she went straight back into the same business, selling the exact same promises to an entirely new set of hopeful clients, as though the years behind bars had taught her nothing at all except patience. A decade later, in 1878, she was arrested and convicted all over again, the jury reportedly needing only minutes to agree on her guilt. This time she never came home. Madame Rachel died behind prison walls in 1880, having spent roughly 2 decades convincing the wealthiest women in London that beauty could be purchased, packaged and guaranteed right up until the very moment the law proved otherwise. I find myself thinking about her often against the woman we spoke of earlier, the one who opened her own cellar to a frightened sick street and asked for nothing but a single penny in return. 2 working-class women born into almost identical circumstances of poverty and hardship, each of them reinventing herself entirely through nothing but nerve and sheer force of will, in a century that offered women from their background almost no other paths upward at all. One chose to spend that reinvention lifting her neighbours up. The other chose to spend it slowly, deliberately taking her wealthy clients apart piece by piece, jewel by jewel. History rarely hands us a contrast quite that clean, 2 stories running along such similar starting tracks before splitting so completely in opposite directions, and I think it is worth sitting with for a moment rather than rushing past it. What strikes me most about this entire chapter of the Victorian story is how much of it came down to a single quiet piece of psychology. Once you convince someone that their natural face is somehow not enough, that flaw and beauty exist on some invisible urgent timeline, they will often reach for whatever promises a shortcut, almost regardless of the cost written in the fine print, or in this case not written at all. Nobody nibbling on those arsenic wafers thought of themselves as reckless. They thought of themselves as sensible women simply following the trusted advice of a doctor, a magazine or a fashionable shop with royal warrants painted proudly above its door. We would love to believe we've grown past that particular weakness, and yet the beauty aisle of any pharmacy today still whispers roughly the same promise, only with better regulation standing quietly behind it, and a much shorter list of ingredients that could actually kill you. But the face and the skin were never the only battlegrounds Victorian women were fighting on. If you truly wanted to be seen as the picture of fashionable femininity, your face was only the beginning. The real transformation, the one that could actually reshape a body from the inside out, was happening somewhere else entirely. Laced tightly around the ribs, one pull at a time. Picture the scene properly, because this one deserves a moment of real stillness before we move through it. A young woman stands facing a bedpost, both hands gripping it for balance, while behind her a sister, a mother or a lady's maid, braces one foot against the small of her back and pulls the laces of her corset tighter and then tighter again. She exhales everything she can, feeling the whalebone press firmly against her ribs with every breath she lets go. The lacing tightens further still, Somewhere beneath the layers of fabric, a rigid strip of steel or whalebone sewn vertically down the front of the garment and known as the busk holds the whole structure upright, while dozens of thinner bones curve around her torso like the ribs of a ship. This was not a rare or scandalous scene tucked away behind closed doors. For a great many fashionable Victorian women, it was simply how the morning began, repeated with quiet, practiced routine in bedrooms across the country. The goal was a silhouette we still recognise instantly today, a dramatically narrow waist sitting between a full bust and full hips, an hourglass so exaggerated it earned its own nickname at the time, the wasp waist. Some fashionable women aimed for a waist measuring somewhere between 17 and 19 inches, a number that sounds almost fictional next to a modern tape measure. Would you even be able to guess your own waist measurement right now without checking? Most of us have no real idea, and yet a Victorian dressmaker could probably tell you hers down to the exact inch, because an entire life could quietly be organised around that single number, and the shaping of that waist did not begin in adulthood. Many young girls were placed into their first training corset well before they had finished growing a smaller, softer version of the adult garment, meant to gradually accustom a child's body to the pressure it would carry for the rest of her life. The expectation was clear, and rarely questioned out loud. By the age of 14, a respectable young woman would already be laced into a proper corset for most of her waking hours. Some accounts even describe girls being expected to sleep in them, so that the shaping never truly stopped, not even for a single night's rest. Now, before we go any further, let me ask you something. What comes to mind when you picture a Victorian corset? For most of us, it is some version of the same dramatic scene, a woman gasping for air, ribs visibly crushed inward, fainting dramatically onto a nearby couch the moment nobody is looking. That image did not come from nowhere. Doctors writing at the time built an entire case against the corset that reads almost like a list of horrors: difficulty breathing, collapsed lungs, bruised or fractured ribs, stunted growth in younger wearers, dizziness and fainting caused by restricted blood flow, a slowly curving spine, chronic digestive trouble, and displacement of the internal organs themselves pushed out of their natural position by the relentless pressure of whalebone and steel. One London medical journal in 1869 put it about as bluntly as Victorian prose allowed itself to get warning that tight lacing seriously limited, almost entirely shut down, the natural movement of the diaphragm during breathing. Looking back through these old warnings feels a little like flipping through a modern article about the dangers of smoking, except the danger in this case was a fashionable undergarment, worn by a large share of the female population for most of a century. And yet, even as doctor after doctor published warning after warning, corset manufacturers found a way to spin the entire controversy to their own advantage. Advertisements throughout the period began promoting so-called health corsets, garments supposedly engineered with the wearer's well-being in mind, gentler boning, better support, none of the dangers those tiresome physicians kept writing about. Whether these health corsets were meaningfully different from any other corset on the market is at best an open question. What is not in doubt is that an entire industry had learned to sell the exact same product back to worried customers as the solution to the very problem it may have been causing in the first place. One particularly cold-blooded commentator in 1846 even joked in print that tight lacing served the public well, since it quietly eliminated the foolish girls and left only the sensible ones behind to become wives and mothers. It is a deeply unsettling line to come across now, and I think it says a great deal about how casually some corners of Victorian society were willing to treat young women's suffering as an acceptable cost of fashion. There was even a strange physical dependency that grew out of daily wear. Women who laced themselves tightly year after year often found that the muscles running along their own back and torso slowly weakened from disuse, since the corset itself was doing so much of the work those muscles would otherwise be doing. Take the corset off after years of this, and a woman might truly struggle simply to sit upright, without it feeling faint or unsteady the moment that constant pressure was suddenly gone. In a strange way, the corset had become less of a costume and more like a piece of her own skeleton borrowed from a Victorian dressmaker. So far, this sounds like exactly the horror story you were probably expecting. And here is where I want to slow down and ask you to hold two very different ideas in your head at the exact same time, because the full truth of this particular story refuses to sit neatly in either one. Modern historians who have spent years actually examining Victorian corsets, rather than simply repeating old rumours about them, have found something far less dramatic than the popular image suggests. Skeletal remains from women who wore corsets throughout their lifetimes typically show only slight gradual changes to the rib cage, not the catastrophic crushing so often described. A properly fitted corset worn at a reasonable tightness actually offered a fair amount of structural support, arguably closer to a well-made modern undergarment than to a medieval torture device. And one particularly persistent myth that wealthy Victorian women had their lower ribs surgically removed to achieve a smaller waist appears to have no real historical evidence behind it at all. Fashion historians who have combed through medical records from the period have found nothing to support it. It seems to be a story that simply sounded plausible enough to survive, repeated so many times that most of us now assume it must be true. Even the low, elegant sofas we now picture whenever someone mentions a Victorian woman fainting the so-called fainting couches were not actually built or marketed for that dramatic purpose at all. At the time, these pieces of furniture were simply called day beds, a fashionable style borrowed from ancient Greek and Roman design that had nothing whatsoever to do with corsets or collapsing women. We attached the more dramatic name to them much later, long after the Victorians themselves had moved on, because the story fits so neatly with everything else we already believed about the era. You've probably seen this exact myth show up in a costume drama or two, honestly. Modern film productions chasing a dramatic corset lacing scene have occasionally cinched actors into garments laced far tighter than any respectable Victorian dressmaker would have actually recommended purely for visual effect, and those same actors have later described the experience in interviews using language that sounds almost gothic, struggling to breathe, feeling as though internal organs had physically shifted. It makes for a wonderful behind-the-scenes story, the kind that spreads quickly online precisely because it confirms exactly what we already expected to hear. It also tells you far more about a costume department's choices on a film set, and perhaps a director's appetite for a striking visual, than it tells you about how most real Victorian women actually experienced wearing one every single day of their own lifetimes. A costume built for a handful of dramatic scenes across a few weeks of filming is simply not the same object as a garment fitted by a professional corsetier and worn gradually adjusted to across an entire lifetime. So which version is true, honestly, both in a way depending entirely on how tightly a woman chose or was pressured to lace herself, and for how many years of her life? There was a real measurable middle ground here, and one curious doctor actually went looking for it. In 1889, a physician named Dr. Kianowski ran a small but remarkably thorough study on 30 women, most of whom regularly wore tightly laced corsets, measuring exactly what happened to their bodies under real physical strain. This was not a doctor simply repeating fashionable medical gossip from a comfortable armchair. He had each woman run roughly 300 meters first without a corset, then again fully laced, and he wrote down every number he could measure along the way. Without the corset, pulse rates after the run landed somewhere around 140 beats a minute. laced tightly, those same women's hearts were racing past 160, in some cases closer to 176. Breathing rates climbed just as sharply, more than doubling in some of the women he tested. Among the larger group of corset wearers he examined afterward, a meaningful share showed signs of a shifted, or in his own words, a movable kidney. Others showed chronic digestive trouble, early lung irritation, or anemia. This was not myth or moral panic dressed up as science. This was an actual physician with an actual stopwatch and a notebook full of real numbers documenting genuine physiological strain on real women's bodies, more than a century before anyone thought to seriously question whether fashion and physiology might be quietly at war with one another. And there is one more thread running through this story that deserves to be handled with real care rather than sensational detail. Around this same period, a physician named Sir William Withy Gull became one of the first doctors in England to formally describe a pattern he observed almost exclusively in young women, a refusal to eat occurring without any underlying physical illness he could find to explain it. In 1873 he gave this pattern a name that has stayed with us ever since anorexia nervosa. His patients, by his own account, tended to be teenage girls and young women in their early 20s, otherwise healthy, and in his words, entirely sane. Historians still debate exactly how tangled this new medical diagnosis became with the era's obsession with an impossibly narrow waist, and I want to be careful here not to draw too straight a line between the two, since the roots of any eating disorder are almost always far more complicated than a single fashion trend. But it is worth simply noticing that the exact same decades that idolized the smallest possible waist were also the decades in which doctors first began formally naming the devastating toll that chasing a body ideal could take on a young woman's health. If you or someone you care about has ever struggled with your own relationship to food or body image, please know that support exists and that reaching out for it is a sign of real strength, not weakness. It is also worth remembering that this entire drama tight-lacing, fainting on cue physicians measuring pulse rates after a forced run, belonged almost entirely to women who had the leisure to faint in the first place. A laundress standing over a wash tub for 10 hours a day, or a factory worker feeding thread through a loom, generally wore a simpler, looser set of stays built for support and modesty, rather than for achieving the smallest possible waist, because there was simply no room in that kind of working day for dizziness or delicate collapse. A woman whose wages depended on staying upright and steady on a factory floor from sunrise to well past dark could not afford the kind of restriction that left fashionable ladies gasping on a daybed after a flight of stairs. The wasp waist, in other words, was every bit as much a symbol of wealth and idleness as it was a fashion statement, one more small, quiet reminder of how differently this entire era treated women depending on which side of the class line they happened to be born on. There is an economic irony tucked inside this story too, one that rarely gets mentioned alongside the medical debate. By the later decades of the century, corset manufacturing had grown into a genuine industrial enterprise in its own right, with large factories employing thousands of workers, many of them women, stitching together the very garments doctors kept publicly condemning. An entire livelihood had grown up around a product whose safety its own customers could not agree on, and whose harshest critics rarely stopped to consider the seamstresses, whose own well-being depended on the controversy staying profitable. I think what strikes me most about the corset, once you actually sit with the real research instead of the popular legend, is how thoroughly it resists becoming either a simple horror story or a simple myth we can comfortably wave away. It caused real strain for some women and remarkably little for others, sometimes depending on nothing more meaningful than how tightly a maid happened to pull the laces on any given morning, or how many years a particular woman had spent wearing one before anybody thought to ask whether it was safe. That kind of uncomfortable, unglamorous middle ground rarely survives the retelling of history nearly as well as a clean dramatic story does, and I think that is worth remembering the next time any historical claim sounds a little too tidy to be entirely true. And if you think we've left this particular tension behind us entirely, take a walk through the shapewear section of almost any modern department store and tell me honestly how far we have actually travelled. We no longer call it a corset, and nobody needs a maid's foot braced against their spine to put it on. But the underlying promise, an instantly smaller waist achieved through firm, unyielding pressure around the torso, has never really left the shelves at all. We simply gave the old idea better marketing, softer fabric, and a name that sounds far less alarming to modern ears. But the corset only ever managed the outside of the female body, the shape a stranger could see across a crowded room. There was an entirely different part of a woman's life during this same era that stayed hidden from view, completely wrapped in so much silence and shame that most Victorian households refused to speak its name out loud, even inside their own four walls, even between a mother and her own daughter, on the very day she needed that conversation the most. Let's name the thing itself, because dancing around it any longer would only prove the exact point I am about to make. Menstruation. A completely ordinary, entirely natural function of the female body, one that roughly half the population experiences for most of their adult life. And in Victorian households it was treated as something closer to a family secret than a fact of biology whispered about between women in half sentences if it was spoken about at all. It is worth pausing here just long enough to notice that this particular silence was never universal, never simply an unavoidable fact of human nature. In plenty of cultures around the world during this exact same century, menstruation carried an entirely different weight. Some Native American communities, for instance, treated a woman's monthly cycle as a time of heightened spiritual insight, rather than shame, with women sometimes gathering together in a shared space and even taking on important decisions for the wider community during that time. Set that side by side with a Victorian drawing room where the subject could not even be raised between a mother and daughter, and you start to realize just how much of this particular shame was manufactured by a specific culture at a specific moment rather than handed down by nature itself. Here is what that silence actually cost real girls. In household after household, a young woman might reach the age of 13 or 14 with almost no warning about what was coming, because her own mother had been raised inside that same wall of silence and simply passed it forward, unbroken generation after generation, as though secrecy itself were a kind of inheritance. Historians who have gone digging through old letters and diaries from the period keep running into the exact same pattern, an almost total absence of the subject from the written record, not because it was not happening, but because women had been trained across generations not to write it down, not even to their own closest friends. When the topic does surface at all, it hides behind euphemism, a vague reference to feeling unwell, to a monthly indisposition, anything but the plain word itself. Can you imagine it for a second? Waking up one ordinary morning at 13 years old with no earlier warning at all, no gentle conversation beforehand, discovering blood, and having absolutely no framework for understanding what was happening to your own body. Some historians studying the period believe this exact scenario left more than a few girls truly convinced, if only for a few terrifying minutes, that they were dying. The confusion was not confined to frightened children either. Even trained physicians of the period sometimes wrote things that sounded almost like folklore dressed up as medicine. One popular medical writer seriously proposed something called vicarious menstruation, The idea that the monthly bleeding could under certain conditions simply reroute itself and exit the body through the nose or the lungs or almost any other opening you could imagine. Picture for a moment a young woman confiding in her doctor about an unexplained nosebleed, only to be told with complete medical seriousness that her body might simply be menstruating through the wrong part of her face. To his credit, this same writer also argued that girls deserve to understand their own bodies well before their first period arrived specifically, so they would not panic and attempt something dangerous trying to stop a natural harmless flow of blood. It is a strange kind of progress, watching one man simultaneously push toward useful, compassionate education, while also sincerely believing blood might occasionally decide to leave through your nostrils instead. So what did women actually use in the absence of any real product built for the job? Mostly whatever cloth was already sitting in the house. Strips of linen or cotton folded and refolded, washed by hand afterward, and used again the following month, a practice that gave us a slang phrase still floating around English today being on the rag. One medical text from 1852 describes the standard method in careful clinical language, a folded cloth referred to plainly as the guard pressed against the body and held in place by a ribbon or string tied around the hips, not entirely unlike a small improvised harness. The same writer noted almost in passing that he had personally met more than a few women who used nothing more elaborate than an extra petticoat simply layering on more fabric and trusting it to absorb whatever it needed to absorb until they could change in private. Think about the sheer quiet logistics of that for a moment. Washing, drying and reusing the same handful of cloths every single month in a house that may or may not have had reliable water on any given day, all while making absolutely certain nobody, especially not a father or a brother, ever caught sight of what was hanging on the line. An entire monthly routine of laundry and concealment managed almost entirely in silence, layered directly on top of every other domestic task already filling a woman's day. Now be honest with me, does any of that sound remotely comfortable to you, let alone reliable? Especially across a full working day spent standing, walking or bending over a wash tub, and this is exactly where the class divide we have circled back to so many times in this story shows up again wearing a slightly different disguise. Because at the very same moment ordinary women were quietly managing all of this, with folded rags and a bit of ribbon. A rather different conversation was unfolding in medical journals and lecture halls, one built almost entirely around the idea that menstruation made a woman fundamentally fragile. One prominent speaker told the Anthropological Society of London that women during their monthly cycle became essentially invalids, unfit for any serious mental or physical effort at all. A claim delivered to a room full of respected men, nodding along in serious agreement as though he were describing settled scientific fact, rather than simple prejudice dressed up in a lecturer's confident tone. And here is a detail that tends to make people laugh out loud the first time they hear it. In an 1891 health guide, a well-known reformer argued that teenage girls ought to be relieved of every demanding duty during this time, encouraged instead to simply lounge on a sofa and let the day pass in whatever way pleased her most. That reformer's name was John Harvey Kellogg. Yes, that Kellogg. The same man whose name still sits on cereal boxes in kitchens around the world today, once built an entire chapter of medical advice around the idea that girls needed a few days of complete rest, built into every single month for as long as they lived. It is a strange thing to picture honestly a man best remembered now for breakfast cereal once holding this much confident authority over how millions of teenage girls he would never personally meet were supposed to spend 1 week out of every 4. It is a lovely theory if you happen to already own a comfortable sofa, and a household staffed well enough to run itself without you for a few days. For the overwhelming majority of Victorian women, that theory simply did not survive contact with real life. Diaries and household records from ordinary working families show almost no evidence of women pampering themselves during their period at all. There was washing to be done, meals to prepare, children to mind, and in countless cases a factory floor or a laundry to report to, regardless of how anyone happened to be feeling that week. A servant girl could hardly explain to her employer that she needed 3 days on a sofa each month, and a laundress standing over the same steaming tubs we described earlier in this story certainly had no such luxury waiting for her either. The idea of menstruation as a delicate sofa-bound event belonged almost entirely to women wealthy enough to afford the pause. Everyone else simply worked through it, folded rag and all, because the household bills did not politely wait for a woman's body to feel ready. There was an even more consequential version of this same argument at work, one that reached well beyond any single household. A meaningful number of Victorian physicians actively opposed higher education for women, arguing with complete sincerity that the physical demands of menstruation and the intellectual demands of serious study were simply incompatible within the same body. Push a young woman too hard toward books and examinations, the argument went, and you risked producing, in their own unsettling phrase, weakened and sickly future children somewhere down the line. Looking at that argument now, it is almost impossible not to notice how neatly it served a second unspoken purpose. Keeping women out of universities required no locked door at all, only a medical opinion dressed up convincingly enough to sound like concern. It took decades of women's colleges quietly proving year after year that their own graduates remained entirely healthy, married, and became mothers just as capable as anyone else before that particular medical theory finally began losing its grip on public opinion. Eventually, commerce did what compassion alone had failed to do, and began chipping away awkwardly, as it was at the practical side of this problem. In the 1850s, a device called the sanitary apron appeared on the market, a rubber garment tied around the pelvis meant to hold a cloth pad more securely in place and protect clothing underneath. By most surviving accounts, it achieved this goal at the cost of being hot, damp, and thoroughly unpleasant to wear for any length of time, particularly for a woman already spending her day near a hot stove or bent over a washtub full of steaming water. Later in the century, some women turned instead to natural sea sponges, prized, because they could be rinsed and reused, which felt like an improvement right up until you consider what it actually meant to rely on something harvested from the ocean floor for something this personal, with no real guarantee of how clean that sponge truly was after its third or fourth use. By the very end of the 1890s, a mail-order catalogue quietly began advertising something called the Ladies' Doily Belt, an elastic waistband fitted with cotton pads that could be attached and removed as needed, priced at around 40 cents for the set. The advertisement itself, tucked several pages deep into a much larger catalogue, between farm tools and kitchenware, described the product in language so careful and roundabout that a reader unfamiliar with its actual purpose could easily have skimmed straight past it without understanding what it was for at all. It promised only that the item was in its own words an almost necessary article for ladies at certain times, easily adjusted and unlikely to interfere with other garments, phrasing so deliberately bland it managed to advertise a product without ever quite admitting what the product actually did. That vagueness was not an accident. It was the entire business strategy. And then in 1896, an American company built an entirely new kind of product, from the ground up a truly disposable sanitary pad sold under the name Lister's Towels, borrowed in tribute from the very same surgeon whose insistence on cleanliness in the operating theatre we spoke about earlier in this story. It should have been a revolution, a simple practical answer to a problem women had been quietly solving with rags and ribbon for generations. Instead, it was a commercial disaster. Advertising restrictions of the period made it nearly impossible to even describe what the product did in a newspaper or magazine, and women understandably felt far too embarrassed to walk up to a male shopkeeper and ask for something that would openly announce exactly what was happening inside their own bodies. A perfectly good, perfectly practical invention sat quietly on shelves, unsold, defeated not by its design, but by an entire culture's inability to simply say the word out loud. It would take a full generation and a rather unexpected assist from the battlefields of the First World War before a workable solution to that particular embarrassment finally emerged. In the years just after Victoria's own long reign had ended, retailers finally landed on a solution embarrassingly simple. In hindsight, leave the boxes sitting openly on the counter alongside a small container for payment, and let a customer take what she needed, drop in her money and leave without ever once having to speak to the clerk standing right there. It was not clever packaging or a bold new advertisement that finally solved this problem. It was simply removing the one thing every woman had been dreading all along the conversation itself. I find something quietly remarkable about this entire chapter of the story, honestly. This was an era loudly publicly obsessed with cleanliness, with sewers and soap and scrubbed front steps, an era we've spent this entire evening exploring together in exhausting detail. And yet the most ordinary, most universal bodily function among half of its entire population was treated as something too shameful to even name inside the privacy of one's own home. Cleanliness, it turns out, was never really the whole point. Visibility was. What could be seen, smelled, or judged by a neighbour mattered enormously. What happened privately, quietly inside a woman's own body mattered so little to public conversation that it barely left a trace in the historical record at all. I wonder sometimes how differently that entire generation of young women might have moved through the world if even one uncomfortable conversation had happened a little earlier, a little more openly in just a few more households. How much needless fear, how many private moments of a 13-year-old girl truly believing something was wrong with her might have simply evaporated with a single honest sentence spoken a week or two ahead of time. It costs so little to say a true thing out loud, and this era spent generations proving just how much silence can cost instead. But silence around the body was never confined to what happened inside it. There was another room in every Victorian home built entirely around a different kind of privacy, one just as loaded with shame, just as rarely spoken about at the dinner table, and just as central to understanding how this entire era actually lived day to day behind closed doors. It had nothing to do with what a person's body produced naturally each month, and everything to do with what every single human body produces every single day, waiting quietly behind a small, unassuming door that almost nobody in polite Victorian conversation ever dared to mention by name. -E. Let's step through that unassuming door together, because what waited behind it says more about this era than almost anything else we've covered tonight. It is such a small, ordinary door in the grand sweep of history, and yet an entire tangle of shame, invention, class division, and quiet human labour was hiding right behind it, waiting for someone to finally take a proper look. For most of the Victorian period, that door led not to a modern bathroom but to a chamber pot tucked discreetly beneath a bed, or hidden inside a piece of furniture built specifically to disguise its purpose. Wealthier households often owned what was politely called a commode, a wooden cabinet or padded seat, that looked at a glance like an ordinary chair or a small cupboard, sometimes even upholstered to match the rest of the bedroom furniture, until you lifted the lid and found a porcelain bowl waiting underneath. Some of these bowls were surprisingly beautiful, hand-painted with flowers or delicate patterns gilded around the rim in some of the finer homes, as though decorating the object might somehow soften what it was actually for. A guest wandering into an unfamiliar bedroom might honestly mistake the thing for a piece of ordinary furniture, which was of course precisely the entire point of the design. Someone of course had to empty that bowl every single morning, and in a large household that task almost always fell to the lowest ranking servant in the building. Often a young girl barely into her teens working her way up from the very bottom of the domestic hierarchy, one unglamorous chore at a time carrying the covered bowl down narrow back staircases before the family upstairs had even opened their eyes. It was smelly, undignified work ranked somewhere near the very bottom of every servant's mental list of preferred duties, and it tells you a great deal about how thoroughly this era managed to hide its own bodily reality behind other people's labour tucked safely out of sight of anyone who mattered enough to be spared the sight of it. For families without servants, without a spare room, without so much as a shared outdoor privy that did not already serve half a dozen neighbouring households, the whole question became considerably less genteel. In the poorest parts of industrial cities, a single privy built over a shared cesspit might serve an entire court of houses. Sometimes dozens of families relying on the same overworked, poorly drained hole in the ground, often positioned uncomfortably near the very same standpipe supplying their drinking water. Waiting your turn in the cold before dawn alongside half the street was simply an accepted part of daily life for a huge share of the Victorian population, uncomfortable as that might sound to modern ears. We have already spent plenty of time this evening on exactly how unevenly access to something as basic as water was distributed across Victorian society. The bathroom, it turns out, followed precisely the same unfair math, right down to the very same neighbourhoods drawing the very same short straw. Now here is where the story gets legitimately fun, because there is a myth about all of this that I suspect quite a few of you are already carrying around in your head without realising it is wrong. Say the words flush toilet out loud to almost anyone, and there is a solid chance the name Thomas Crapper will pop into their mind within about 2 seconds. It is a wonderfully fitting name of the job, admittedly, and it has stuck to popular imagination like almost nothing else in this entire story. But Thomas Crapper did not invent the flush toilet. He was not even born early enough to have a real shot at it. In fact, during the very same year the first public flush toilets in history opened their doors in London, young Thomas Crapper was all of 14 years old, likely nowhere near a position to be revolutionising bathroom technology. The real story stretches back much further, and it belongs to a rotating cast of characters who rarely get any credit at all. The very first working flush toilet was built all the way back in 1596 by a clever, somewhat mischievous nobleman named John Harrington, who designed it as a gift for his godmother, none other than Queen Elizabeth I. He gave his invention a cheeky nickname, Ajax, a pun on an old slang term for an outdoor privy, and he even wrote an entire rather cheerful pamphlet about the device, mixing genuine engineering explanation with jokes that would have made his royal godmother's more serious courtiers roll their eyes. The Queen reportedly found the whole device delightful and had one installed for her own use at Richmond Palace, and yet the idea went almost nowhere for nearly 2 centuries afterward, mostly because there was no city sewer system anywhere in existence yet capable of carrying the waste away once it was flushed. Harrington had built a beautiful solution for a problem the rest of the world was not yet equipped to actually solve. The real breakthrough came in 1775 when a Scottish watchmaker named Alexander Cumming patented a small but transformative improvement: a bent section of pipe shaped roughly like the letter S positioned just beneath the bowl. That curve trapped a small amount of water permanently inside it, creating an airtight seal that stopped foul sewer gas from drifting back up into the house every time someone used the toilet. It sounds almost too simple to matter, and yet that single bend in a pipe solved the one problem that had kept flush toilets from becoming truly livable technology for nearly 200 years. A watchmaker of all people more accustomed to gears and springs than plumbing ended up quietly reshaping how humans have handled their own waste ever since. Every flush toilet you've ever used in your life still relies on some version of that exact same bent pipe, sitting quietly out of sight, doing precisely the job Cumming designed it to do 2.5 centuries ago. A few years later, another inventor named Joseph Bramah refined the mechanism, further adding a hinged flap that sealed the bowl even more reliably, and his particular design remained the industry standard for the better part of the following century. So if Thomas Crapper did not invent any of this, what did he actually do? To his real credit, Crapper built a hugely successful sanitary engineering business, later in the century earned royal warrants for supplying fixtures to the households of several members of the royal family, and became one of the first people to display toilets and bathroom fixtures openly in a proper showroom complete with a shop window, at a time when most people considered the entire subject too indelicate to display in public view at all. He improved several existing designs, patented a better floating valve mechanism that helped cisterns refill more reliably, and helped make indoor plumbing feel like a respectable, even fashionable addition to a proper home rather than something to be quietly hidden away. He simply arrived several generations after the actual invention, at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right name, to become permanently and rather unfairly famous for popularizing something he never actually invented in the first place. There is one more figure from this story who deserves far more recognition than he usually gets, and his contribution came with a phrase that has quietly survived in English long after most people forgot where it came from. In 1851, London hosted the Great Exhibition, an enormous international showcase of industry and invention, held inside a vast glass building nicknamed the Crystal Palace, expected to draw millions of visitors from every corner of the world. Organisers realised rather late in their planning that they had no actual bathroom facilities, prepared for the crowds about to descend on the building, and letters of concern reportedly reached the exhibition commissioners, warning that foreign visitors accustomed to proper conveniences in their own capital cities would find the oversight rather embarrassing. A plumber named George Jennings stepped in and installed the first public flush toilets the world had ever seen, cheekily nicknamed monkey closets by the trade because of how the mechanism looked from the side. For a single penny, a visitor received a clean seat, the use of a towel and comb, and even a quick shoe shine, a small luxury bundled together for a price that most working visitors could easily afford. Over the 6 months, the exhibition ran, more than 827,000 people paid that penny, and an entirely new phrase slipped quietly into the English language: to spend a penny. When the exhibition ended, Jennings fought to keep his toilets running rather than let them be dismantled, and within a year London had its first proper public street toilets. He did not stop there either. A few years later, Jennings wrote directly to the officials responsible for the city's sewers, describing the streets of London in blunt, almost indignant language as covered in what he called plague spots, offensive to the eye, and a disgrace to a civilized city, and offering at his own expense to help build proper public conveniences to fix it. It is a small, oddly touching thing to picture, honestly, a plumber standing up in front of exhibition organisers and government officials alike, insisting that ordinary people deserved somewhere clean and dignified to relieve themselves in public, at a moment when most polite society still refused to even say the word toilet out loud in mixed company. Now be honest with me, had you ever actually wondered where that phrase came from before tonight? Or had it simply been floating around your whole life as background noise? Even once a toilet flushed properly, there was still the small matter of what came afterward, and this part of the story tends to surprise people even more than the toilet itself. For most of the century, whatever paper happened to be lying around the house did the job. Old newspapers, worn-out catalogue pages, even almanac pages, which later publishers began selling with a convenient hole already punched through one corner, specifically so the whole booklet could be hung on a nail inside an outhouse once nobody in the house wanted it on the shelf anymore. Imagine flipping through last year's farming almanac while sitting in an outdoor privy in the middle of a cold winter morning, tearing off a page at a time as needed, and you start to get a sense of just how casually improvised this entire side of daily life still was for most of the century. It was not until 1857 that an American entrepreneur named Joseph Gaiety in New York began selling something purpose, built for the job individual sheets, infused with a bit of aloe, packaged in bundles of 500, and marketed less as a comfort item and more as a genuine medical treatment for certain uncomfortable ailments, with his own name proudly printed on every single sheet, almost like a business card nobody ever asked to see twice. It struggled to catch on largely because the free alternative sitting in every parlour yesterday's newspaper cost absolutely nothing at all. It would take until the very final decades of the century before a British company began manufacturing something closer to what you likely reached for this morning, sold in perforated sheets and eventually on a proper roll rather than in loose packets. And here is a detail worth sitting with for a moment before we move on. Even after London completed its extraordinary underground sewer system, the very achievement we spent our first hour together exploring in detail, the humble earth closet, essentially a wooden box built over a bucket of ash or soil, remained the more common household fixture for decades afterward in ordinary homes across the country. Emptying and refreshing that bucket with fresh ash became just another quiet, unglamorous chore, woven into the rhythm of a household's week. Not unlike the chamber pot duty we described earlier, simply relocated to a small shed at the bottom of the garden instead of a bedroom corner. Building a magnificent underground network of tunnels turned out to be in some ways the easier half of the problem. Convincing an entire nation to actually install indoor plumbing room by room, house by house at real expense to each individual family took a great deal longer, and cost a great deal more than any single engineer or politician could simply decree into existence overnight. A sewer, brilliant as it was, can only carry away what people are actually able to flush into it in the first place. What strikes me most about this particular corner of Victorian life is how thoroughly ordinary it all was, and how completely that ordinariness got buried under layers of polite denial anyway. Every single person in this story, wealthy or poor, needed exactly the same basic thing every single day, and yet an entire vocabulary of euphemism disguised furniture and quiet embarrassment grew up specifically to avoid ever acknowledging that shared universal fact out loud. We built engineering marvels to move the problem out of sight, invented playful nicknames like spending a penny to avoid naming it directly, and handed the least glamorous parts of the job to whoever in the household had the least power to refuse it. If that does not tell you something true about how this entire society organized itself around comfort, status, and quiet denial, I am not sure what would. There is something almost comforting, though, in knowing that a watchmaker, a queen's godson, and a stubborn plumber, willing to write angry letters about plague spots on his own city's streets, are the actual unsung heroes of a story most of us assumed belonged entirely to a man named Crapper. History rarely hands credit to the people who actually earned it, and this particular corner of it is no exception at all. But shame around plumbing and privacy was almost gentle compared to what was still unfolding at this exact same moment inside the era's hospitals and delivery rooms, where a far more dangerous kind of stubbornness was quietly leading to deaths that better habits could easily have prevented. Step inside a maternity ward in Vienna for a moment, because the numbers waiting for you there are hard to believe until you actually see them side by side. In the 1840s, Vienna General Hospital ran 2 separate maternity clinics, sitting just a short walk apart from one another, both treating the exact same kind of patient under the exact same roof. One clinic was staffed by physicians and the medical students training under them. The other was staffed entirely by midwives and their own trainees. And year after year, an almost unbelievable gap opened up between the two. In the doctor's clinic, somewhere near 1 in every 10 mothers died from a violent, fast-moving infection, known at the time as childbed fever, a sickness that could take a healthy new mother from fever to death within a matter of days. In the midwife's clinic, just down the corridor, that same number sat closer to 2 or 3 in every 100. Word of the difference spread through the city itself, and it spread the way any genuine terror spreads quickly and without much need for official confirmation. Women admitted to the hospital in labour reportedly begged, sometimes on their knees, to be assigned to the midwife's side, instead terrified of the doctor's ward and the death rate everyone in Vienna already seemed to know about. Some women, according to hospital records from the period, chose to give birth in the street outside, rather than risk being assigned a bed on the wrong side of that building. Think about that for a second. Women in active labour willing to take their chances on cold cobblestones outdoors, rather than accept the supposedly superior medical care waiting just inside those doors. A young Hungarian physician named Ignaz Semmelweis took charge of that doctor's clinic in 1846, and the gap between the two wards consumed him almost immediately. He tested theory after theory, some of them fairly reasonable, others increasingly desperate. Maybe it was overcrowding. Maybe it was the position women were placed in during delivery. He even noticed and briefly suspected that a priest carrying a small bell walked directly through the doctor's ward on his way to deliver last rites to dying patients, wondering whether the sound and sight of approaching death might somehow be frightening other women into a worse condition. He asked the priest to take a longer, quieter route around the ward instead, just to rule it out. It made no difference at all. Maybe he considered in his darker moments it was simple bad luck, statistical noise dressed up as tragedy. Nothing he tested actually explained the numbers sitting right in front of him. Then, in 1847, a colleague of his named Jakob Kolečka was accidentally cut by a student's scalpel while the two of them were performing an autopsy together. Within days, Kolečka fell seriously ill, and soon after he died. What struck Semmelweis going through his friend's final symptoms was how closely they matched the exact same illness, killing mothers in his own ward right down to the smallest details. Here is where his mind made the leap that would eventually change the course of medicine, though almost nobody around him wanted to hear it. Doctors and medical students in his clinic spent their mornings performing autopsies in the hospital's dissection rooms, learning anatomy directly from the bodies of patients who had died the day before. Then, having barely rinsed their hands, they walked straight into the maternity ward and began examining labouring women one after another without a single thought given to what they might be carrying between one patient and the next. The midwives across the corridor never set foot in a dissection room at all. They had no contact with the dead whatsoever, only with the living women in their own care. Semmelweis called whatever was being carried on those unwashed hands cadaverous particles, since the language of actual germs of microscopic organisms living and spreading between bodies did not exist yet in any form doctors of his era would have recognized. He could not name the mechanism. He could only see with startling clarity that it travelled on hands and that hands could be cleaned. So he ordered something almost embarrassingly simple. Every physician and student under his authority now had to wash their hands in a solution of chlorinated lime, a fairly harsh, strong-smelling chemical, before examining any patient at all, and especially after leaving the autopsy room. Can you imagine how strange that instruction must have sounded to a room full of trained physicians in 1847, a junior colleague informing them that their own hands, the very tools of their profession, needed scrubbing before they were fit to touch a living patient? The results arrived almost immediately. Mortality in his clinic collapsed from somewhere near 1 in 10 down to roughly 1 in 50. For several months running in 1848, his ward recorded no maternal deaths from childbed fever at all, an outcome that would have sounded like a fairy tale to anyone working there just a year earlier. Now, if you were running a hospital in 1848 and someone handed you numbers like that, what would you expect to happen next? Congratulations, probably. Recognition. Perhaps his method spreading swiftly to every maternity ward across Europe. Instead, Semmelweis was met with something closer to open hostility. To understand why, you have to sit for a moment inside the mindset of a respected Victorian-era physician. A doctor's hands at the time were considered a mark of his profession and his social standing clean by definition, simply because a gentleman's hands were assumed to be clean. Suggesting that a physician's own hands might be the thing killing his patients was not received as helpful medical advice. It was received as a personal insult and accusation that these respected men had been unknowingly murdering mothers for years through simple carelessness. Pride, professional reputation, and a fair amount of wounded ego all worked together to make an entire community of educated men dig in against a solution that was by every measure available to them already working. Colleagues dismissed his data as coincidence. Others complained that Semmelweis could not adequately explain in scientific terms anyone found satisfying exactly why the chlorinated lime solution worked, since the actual germs responsible would not be reliably identified and accepted by the wider medical community for several more decades. Without that mechanism to point to, his results looked to a skeptical eye uncomfortably near superstition, dressed up as medicine regardless of how many mothers were surviving because of it. Some physicians offended by the implication simply refused to comply with the new washing requirement at all, once Semmelweis eventually lost his position and his influence over the ward. Mortality rates predictably crept right back upward once the practice quietly lapsed. And here is a detail that always stops me in my tracks a little. Semmelweis was not even the first person to notice this particular pattern. Decades earlier, in the 1790s, a doctor working in Aberdeen named Alexander Gordon had already suggested in his own writing that childbed fever could be carried directly from patient to patient by the very physicians and midwives attending them, and had even suggested attendants change their clothing between cases. His warning went almost entirely unheard, too buried in a modest publication that most of his contemporaries never bothered to look at closely if they noticed it at all. Two different doctors working 2 generations apart in 2 different countries independently stumbling onto roughly the same uncomfortable truth, and watched almost entirely alone as it was quietly set aside both times. It is the exact same shape of story we already spent time with in the very first hour of tonight's journey together, a correct answer arriving early dressed in the wrong kind of proof for its moment, and simply waiting decade after decade for the rest of the world to finally catch up. Semmelweis, for his part, did not handle the rejection with much patience or grace, and it is worth being honest about that too, rather than turning him into a flawless martyr. He grew furious at his critics, and instead of refining his argument or courting allies within the medical establishment, he began firing off open letters to prominent doctors across Europe, accusing them outright of being responsible for a kind of ongoing massacre. His own book on the subject, when he finally published it, came across as rambling and disorganized, even to sympathetic readers, undermining the very case he was so desperate to make. Whether from the sheer exhaustion of being ignored, or from a deeper illness that historians still debate today, his mental state slowly deteriorated across the 1860s. In 1865, colleagues arranged to have him committed to an asylum, reportedly under the pretense of visiting a new medical facility together. Once inside, accounts suggest he realized what was happening and tried to leave, at which point he was restrained by guards, and in the process sustained a wound that became infected. He died just 2 weeks later at only 47 years old from the exact same kind of infection his own hand-washing protocol had been designed to prevent. It is almost too cruel a detail to be real, and yet it is simply what happened. A man who spent the final years of his career insisting that unwashed hands could kill was ultimately killed indirectly by exactly that. Vindication came but far too late for him to witness a single moment of it. Within 2 decades of his death, the work of scientists including Louis Pasteur helped establish germ theory as accepted medical fact, finally giving Semmelweis's cadaverous particles an actual name and a visible shape under a microscope. A British surgeon named Joseph Lister, working from those same emerging ideas, began soaking surgical instruments' wounds and even the air of his operating theatre in carbolic acid starting in 1867, and watched infection rates among his surgical patients fall dramatically in some reported cases from roughly 1 in every 2 operations proving fatal down to a small fraction of that. Where Semmelweis had been met with fury and dismissal, Lister, arriving at almost the identical conclusion just 2 decades later, was gradually met with something closer to respect, perhaps because the wider scientific world had by then finally caught up enough to actually hear him. It is Lister's own name borrowed decades later for a certain disposable sanitary product we discussed a little earlier tonight, and it is worth pausing on that connection for a second. One man's insistence on cleanliness in the operating theatre became so deeply woven into the culture of medicine that manufacturers were still borrowing his reputation to sell hygiene products to the public well into the following century. There was one more figure fighting this exact same uphill battle during these years, and she deserves her own moment here because her weapon of choice was neither a scalpel nor a bottle of chlorinated lime but a chart. Florence Nightingale, working with wounded soldiers during the Crimean War, noticed something that horrified her. Far more men were dying from infections and disease inside the field hospitals than from injuries sustained on the battlefield itself. Official reports at the time buried that fact deep inside pages of dense text and columns of numbers, exactly the kind of document a busy government official could skim past without ever grasping the true scale of what was happening. To make that point impossible for officials to ignore or misunderstand, she taught herself statistics and designed an entirely new kind of diagram, a colourful wedge-shaped chart that let a viewer grasp the scale of preventable death within a single glance, without needing to wade through a single page of dense written reports. Sending soldiers home with better food or new weapons meant nothing. Her data quietly insisted if the hospitals meant to heal them were killing more men than any battlefield ever could. Her data helped force sweeping reforms in military hospital sanitation, and that same visual technique she pioneered is still taught in statistics courses today, used by people who often have no idea it was first built to keep 19th century soldiers alive. She may not have fully understood germ theory in the way we do now, and she leaned more toward the old belief in cleaner, fresher air than in true microscopic contagion, but she understood with total clarity that clean hospitals kept people alive, and she understood exactly how to make people in power actually look at the evidence, instead of simply dismissing it the way Semmelweis's own colleagues had. There is a term still used in medicine and science today born directly from this exact story, the Semmelweis reflex, the very human tendency to reject new evidence automatically simply because it contradicts what everyone already confidently believes to be true. Doctors still use it to describe colleagues who dismiss inconvenient findings. Researchers in fields that have nothing to do with medicine use it too whenever a community of experts closes ranks against an outsider bearing uncomfortable data. What strikes me most, turning this story over one more time, is how little the actual science mattered in the moment it counted most. Semmelweis had real numbers. He had a working solution, one that had already saved dozens of mothers before anyone bothered to seriously argue with him about it. What he did not have was the right social standing, the right polished delivery, or quite enough patience to survive the wounded pride of the men he was trying to save from themselves. Being right, it turns out, has never been enough on its own. You also need someone willing to actually listen, and a messenger. The room is prepared to trust two things: history handed generously to Lister and Nightingale, and almost entirely withheld from the man who saw the truth first. But hand-washing and sterilized instruments could only protect a patient once they were already inside a hospital, under a trained doctor's watch, surrounded by people who at least understood by this point what the stakes actually were. For the smallest, most fragile members of Victorian society, the ones who could not speak up, could not refuse, and could not tell anyone something felt wrong, the real danger was often waiting quietly at home, instead hidden inside a small spoonful of something a loving, exhausted parent had been told with complete confidence was perfectly safe to give. -E. That spoonful deserves its own moment tonight, because behind it sits one of the most heartbreaking contradictions in this entire story. Parents who loved their children desperately reaching for exactly the wrong thing sold to them by people who knew better and said nothing at all. Before we go any further, let's be honest about why any of this happened in the first place. A teething infant in Victorian England was not a minor inconvenience. It meant weeks of screaming through the night, swollen gums, fevers that frightened even experienced mothers, and an exhausted household desperate for even a single unbroken hour of sleep. Doctors of the period had little to offer beyond vague, unhelpful advice, and grandmothers passed down home remedies that rarely worked for long. Some households relied on nothing more than a smooth ring of coral or carved ivory handed to the baby to chew on, a gentle, harmless tradition, stretching back generations, and for many families that alone was simply not enough to survive a truly difficult night. If you have ever held a wailing baby at 3 a.m. with absolutely nothing left to try, you already understand on some level exactly why so many parents reached eagerly for anything promising relief. This is not a story about foolish people. It is a story about tired, frightened people failed by almost everyone they had reason to trust. The best-known name in this whole grim chapter was a product called Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup, sold across both sides of the Atlantic, and marketed in its own advertising as gentle enough to calm any restless child. Mothers gave it freely generation after generation, confident they were doing exactly what a caring parent should do. The syrup did work in the narrowest sense of that word. Babies given a dose fell quiet almost immediately, sometimes for hours at a stretch. The reason had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with morphine. One chemist who analysed a bottle of the syrup in 1870 found nearly a full grain of morphine dissolved into every single ounce. The bottle's own printed instructions recommended a dose equal to roughly 10 drops of laudanum for an infant of only 3 months old, doubling that amount for a baby of 6 months. Doctors of the period already knew and had already published warnings stating that as few as 4 drops of laudanum had been enough to kill a 9-month-old child. Sit with those two facts side by side for a moment. A product sold openly on pharmacy shelves with printed instructions on the label, recommending a dose that outstripped a known lethal threshold by a significant margin, marketed the entire time as gentle enough for any human or animal. Can you imagine measuring out a dose for your own child using a label that confident with absolutely no reason to question it? The company kept morphine in its official recipe for decades after doctors began raising alarms, only removing it from the British formula in 1909 and the American version several years after that, and even then the alcohol quietly stayed behind for years longer still. An entire industry built its reputation and its profits on parents trusting a label over their own instincts. Not every product on that same shelf was hiding something dangerous, and it is worth pausing on one small contrast before we move deeper into the darker examples. A Nottingham pharmacist named William Woodward built his own baby remedy around the same time, and rather than leaning on medical language, he borrowed the image of a famous painting showing a powerful infant Hercules, registering it as his trademark to lend the product an air of strength and vitality. It was a clever piece of Victorian marketing using respected art to sell public trust, the exact same trick countless other manufacturers of the era would lean on again and again. His formula, unlike so many of its competitors, did not depend on opium to keep a baby quiet, proof that gentler, honest options existed on the very same shelves for any manufacturer willing to build a reputation on something other than a sedated infant. But Mrs. Winslow's syrup was only the most famous name on a very crowded shelf. Its most notorious rival went by the far gentler-sounding title of Godfrey's Cordial, occasionally nicknamed with a kind of grim affection the mother's friend. It traced its origin back to an apothecary from the early 1700s, and by the middle of the Victorian era it had become a fixture in working households across the country, mixing laudanum with treacle water and a bit of spice into something sweet enough that a baby would happily take it without a fight. One physician who studied its effects in the 1850s documented at least a dozen infant deaths directly traced back to the cordial over a period of just 2 years, and he was quick to point out that the actual number was almost certainly far higher, since so many quiet deaths in cramped, overworked households were simply never investigated at all. That same physician estimated, in a widely circulated book aimed at worried mothers, that roughly 3 out of every 4 deaths attributed to opium in England involved a child under the age of 5. The scale of its use is almost impossible to picture from where we're sitting tonight. One Manchester chemist openly admitted selling half a gallon of Godfrey's Cordial every single week, along with several more gallons of an unbranded cheaper equivalent that druggists simply called Quietness, a name that tells you everything about what parents were actually buying it for. A council member in Nottingham who also worked as a druggist reportedly sold several hundred gallons of laudanum every year from his own shop alone. In parts of the eastern countryside, opium was mixed into something locals called poppy tea, and given to infants so routinely that doctors visiting those districts described the babies there with real alarm writing that some of them looked wasted and shrunken, aged well beyond their months by a substance quietly stealing their growth 1 dose at a time. Now, I want to be careful here because it would be easy sitting comfortably this far removed from any of it to judge these parents harshly. Consider instead a young lace worker earning barely enough to feed her family, required to sit at a loom for the entire length of a working day with no paid leave, no childcare, and an infant who needed constant attention, she simply did not have the hours in the day to give. Her employer expected steady, uninterrupted output, not a mother stepping away every few minutes to soothe a crying child, and the wages she brought home stood between her family and genuine hunger. For her, and for thousands of women exactly like her across the country, that bottle of cordial was not neglect. It was the only bridge between staying employed and watching her family go without food. Historical accounts describe mothers who tried repeatedly to stop pouring the bottle away in a moment of resolve, only to find themselves buying another one the very next week, because the alternative, an unfed family and a lost wage, felt even less survivable than the risk they already half understood they were taking. Can you imagine standing in her position, forced to choose between two outcomes that both terrified you equally? There is a version of this story that unfolds entirely inside a wealthy drawing room, and we've already spent time with it tonight. Women applying poison to their own faces in pursuit of fashion. This is the same danger wearing an entirely different disguise, shaped not by vanity, but by poverty exhaustion, and a system that offered working mothers almost no real alternative at all. One story involves a woman choosing risk in the name of appearance. The other involves a woman choosing risk simply to keep her family fed. It is worth noticing which of those two choices this era judged more harshly in public, and which one it mostly chose to look away from entirely. Parliament actually noticed the scale of the problem, at least briefly. In 1857, a bill was proposed that would have formally classified opium and its derivatives as a controlled poison, restricting how freely it could be sold across the counter to anyone willing to hand over a few pennies. It failed to pass, worn down by determined lobbying from the very trading chemists whose livelihoods depended on exactly this kind of unrestricted sale. Critics of the bill also argued with a certain amount of genuine practicality mixed into their self-interest that any ban would simply push desperate families toward even less regulated, more dangerous sources, instead of solving the underlying problem at all. So the bottles stayed on the shelves, the label copy stayed reassuring, and the practice simply continued quietly, for decades longer than it ever should have, largely untouched by any meaningful oversight, until well into the 20th century. It is worth sitting with that failure for a moment because it breaks the pattern we have followed through most of tonight's story. Time and again this evening we have watched a crisis eventually force real change, slow and painful, as that change often turned out to be. This time the warning arrived early, the evidence was already sitting in coroners' reports and doctors' casebooks, and the system built to respond to exactly this kind of danger simply chose profit over protection, and moved on. There is another quieter tragedy buried inside all of this that rarely makes it into the popular retelling. Babies dosed regularly enough, week after week, did not simply tolerate the substance passively. Their small bodies built up a real dependence on it, needing steadily larger amounts over time to achieve the same quieting effect, and growing noticeably irritable, tense and unsettled whenever a dose was delayed or withheld. A mother trying to finally wean her child off the cordial often found the following days far worse than anything that had come before, the baby crying harder, sleeping less, and seeming almost inconsolable, which understandably convinced more than a few exhausted parents that the medicine must still be needed after all, when in truth their child's small body was simply crying out for something it had been given no choice but to become dependent upon. There is another layer to this tragedy that rarely gets mentioned, and it explains why the true scale of the damage is so difficult to measure even now. When an infant died suddenly during this period, doctors and coroners frequently recorded the cause as overlaying the accidental smothering of a baby by an exhausted parent who had fallen asleep sharing the same bed. It was a plausible explanation, and in many cases a true one. But it was also a convenient one, easier to write down, easier to accept, and far less likely to point an accusing finger at a bottle sitting on the family's own shelf. Historians who have gone back through old inquest records suspect that a meaningful share of those recorded overlaying deaths were in reality opium poisoning wearing a gentler, more forgivable name, one that spared grieving families the added burden of public blame on top of everything else they had already lost. Now be honest with me. If you were a coroner standing in front of a devastated young mother who had already lost her child, which explanation would you have been more inclined to write down? Opium was not the only danger hiding inside a Victorian nursery cabinet either. A separate class of remedy sold specifically as teething powder relied instead on a mercury compound called calomel to supposedly ease a baby's discomfort. Parents dusted it directly onto sore, swollen gums or mixed it into a spoonful of food, trusting the label's confident promises, the same way they trusted every other product on this shelf. Used repeatedly over weeks or months, calomel could trigger a condition doctors eventually named pink disease, leaving an infant's hands and feet swollen, painfully sensitive and strangely discoloured, alongside irritability, poor sleep and a whole cluster of other frightening symptoms nobody at the time correctly traced back to the powder itself. It would take until the middle of the 20th century, astonishingly, before mercury was finally fully removed from teething remedies still being sold to parents. Some brands, to their real credit, quietly avoided the ingredient altogether from a much earlier date and marketed themselves as gentler alternatives, proof that a safer option honestly existed the entire time, sitting right there on the very same shelf, simply overshadowed by louder, more confident competitors willing to cut corners for a lower price. What strikes me most sitting with this whole chapter is how completely it inverts the story we told earlier tonight about arsenic and lead on a wealthy woman's dressing table. That earlier danger grew out of vanity, out of women with money and choices reaching for something they did not actually need. This danger grew out of the exact opposite condition, mothers with no money and no real choices at all, reaching for the only thing standing between them and complete collapse. Different causes, entirely different circumstances, and yet the same quiet, devastating result waiting at the end of both roads. It makes me wonder how many other dangers throughout this whole era followed that exact same pattern, wealth and poverty, arriving at the same tragic destination by two completely different paths, simply because nobody in power thought either group of women was worth protecting properly in the first place. I do not think there are simple villains anywhere in this particular story, only an economy that demanded more from working mothers than any person should reasonably be expected to give a regulatory system, too slow and too easily persuaded by industry pressure to intervene when it mattered most, and manufacturers perfectly willing to keep selling a dangerous product exactly as long as the profits kept arriving. Somewhere in every one of those thousands of quiet, ordinary households, a mother sat rocking a finally sleeping child relieved beyond words for a single hour of peace, with absolutely no way of knowing what that peace was actually costing. If you take one thing from this part of tonight's journey, let it be this: the parents were not the failure here. The system built around them was from the unregulated shelf all the way up to the Parliament that let it stay that way. But not every battle fought inside a Victorian household stayed hidden behind a closed nursery door tucked away in bottles and coroner's reports. Some of it played out in full public view every single day in something as visible and as personal as the hair sitting right on top of every single head in the country, an entirely different kind of daily ritual with its own strange rules, its own quiet suffering, and its own uninvited guests that almost nobody liked to admit they were fighting. Those uninvited guests deserved their moment first, honestly, because almost nobody in this whole story wanted to admit they were hosting any. We've already talked tonight about how rarely Victorian women actually wash their hair, sometimes going a full month between washes, relying on eggs and vinegar, and the occasional splash of rum instead of anything resembling modern shampoo. What we have not talked about yet is everything else that hair was quietly forced to carry, and I promise you it is a far stranger story than a simple washing schedule. Hair, it turns out, was traded like a commodity worn as a memorial, fought over by lawmakers of fashion, and treated as a battlefield in a war against tiny insects nobody wanted to discuss in polite company. Somewhere between all of that, there was barely any room left for it to simply be hair, ordinary, unremarkable strands growing quietly out of a person's own head. Start with the ideal itself. A woman's hair in this era carried her whole reputation on top of her head, long, thick, and unbroken, serving as proof of good health, good breeding, and careful moral character all at once. The trouble is actually achieving that ideal hair, thick and long enough to build the elaborate towering styles, fashionable across the 1860s and 70s, was simply beyond what most women's own natural growth could deliver. Fashion plates from the period show hairstyles piled impossibly high, wound into loops and coils that no ordinary head of hair, no matter how carefully brushed and oiled, could realistically produce on its own. So an entire hidden industry quietly grew up to make up the difference, and it began in places far humbler than any London salon. Across rural Europe, travelling hair collectors moved from village to village, knocking on the doors of peasant women and offering cash for their own natural hair cut short at the scalp and bundled for shipment. Many of these collectors came from particular regions that specialised in the trade, entire local economies quietly organised around the buying and selling of other women's hair. Blonde and silver grey were prized above almost everything else, followed closely by black with naturally curly hair commanding the very highest price of all, since curl was rare, difficult to fake convincingly and endlessly in demand among fashionable customers. Since hair only grows a few inches a year, and a truly valuable length needed several years to develop, some of these travelling buyers would actually pay a woman in advance, essentially placing an order for hair that would not be ready to cut and collect for another 3 or 4 years. Somewhere in rural France or Switzerland, a girl might grow up knowing that a stranger had already in effect purchased her future haircut before she had even finished growing the hair itself. Her own body slowly fulfilling a contract she may have signed as a child. Now sit with that for a second. An entire international trade built on human patience, where the product being sold was quite literally a piece of a stranger's own body, harvested from women who very often needed the money badly enough that refusing the offer was never really an option at all. Would you sell 4 years of your own hair growth today for a handful of coins if the alternative was watching your own family go without? That hair travelled onward into the workshops of wig makers and hairdressers, eventually reappearing styled and curled and pinned atop the heads of wealthy women who had no idea whose head it had originally grown from. It is a strange, almost uncomfortable kind of intimacy when you think about it. 2 women who would never meet connected across an entire social class divide, by nothing more than a few ounces of hair, changing hands for a few coins, one wearing what the other had been forced to give up. This same quiet desperation, a woman's hair as one of the very few valuable things she truly owned outright, would echo for decades afterward in fiction. It is precisely the sacrifice at the heart of a much-loved short story published near the turn of the following century, where a young wife sells her own beautiful hair to buy her husband a gift, not realizing he has just sold his own prized watch to buy her a set of combs for hair that by the time he presents them no longer exists. Readers have cried over that ending for more than a century now, never quite realizing how ordinary, how truly common that exact transaction had already been for real women throughout the entire century before it was written. Hair served an even more personal purpose too, one that had nothing to do with fashion at all. Victorian households developed an entire delicate craft around weaving human hair, usually from a family member who had died, into brooches, bracelets, rings, and elaborate wreaths meant to be displayed proudly in the parlour for every visitor to see. Skilled needleworkers, many of them women travelling from town to town offering their craft for hire, could braid, knot, and shape strands of hair into astonishingly intricate patterns, using techniques with their own specialised names, weaving fine strands over a mould to build a pattern, or working them flat against a table like delicate lacework, sometimes even trapping tiny curls under glass inside a locket worn near the heart. Queen Victoria herself, deep in the decades-long mourning that followed her husband's death, helped popularise the practice further, simply by being seen wearing it, and an entire cottage industry of hair artists rose up to meet the sudden fashionable demand that followed her example. The craft grew respected enough that finished pieces of hair jewellery set in gold and precious stones were proudly displayed at international exhibitions alongside the era's finest engineering and manufacturing achievements, treated as a genuine art form rather than a curiosity sitting in the very same halls that celebrated steam engines and industrial machinery. A piece of someone you loved quite literally kept near your own skin long after the rest of them was gone. There is something both a little unsettling and quietly beautiful about that, and I suspect people felt exactly that same tension about it at the time too, treasuring an object most of us today would likely find a little uncomfortable to hold. Between the rare washes and the constant pinning and styling, daily hair care still meant a great deal of brushing, and this particular ritual carried a warmth the rest of this story has mostly lacked so far tonight. Mothers routinely brushed their daughters' hair each evening 100 long strokes, being the number most often repeated in etiquette manuals and household guides of the day, meant to spread natural oils evenly along the length of the hair and encourage a healthy shine. Whether every single household actually counted to exactly 100 each night is doubtful, but the ritual itself, quiet, repetitive, unhurried, offered something rarer than clean hair. It gave a mother and daughter a guaranteed few minutes of undivided attention at the end of a long day. No chores, no visitors, nothing to interrupt them, just the steady rhythm of a brush moving through hair by candlelight. It is worth remembering that not every Victorian ritual around hair was a burden or a danger. Some of them quietly were simply love dressed up as routine. But let's return to those uninvited guests I mentioned a moment ago, because head lice were an unavoidable feature of Victorian life, and here is the detail that tends to surprise people the most. This was never simply a problem for the poor. Lice do not care in the slightest how much money a person has or how often they bathe. They spread through ordinary physical contact between people, shared combs, shared pillows, children playing together at school, servants styling their employer's hair, all of it moving freely from head to head without the faintest interest in anyone's social standing. Wealthy households were every bit as likely to host an infestation as a crowded tenement, even if fashionable society preferred to imagine otherwise and quietly blame the problem on somebody further down the social ladder, treating a head full of lice as a moral failing rather than simple biology doing exactly what biology does. Have you ever assumed a health problem said something about a person's character or cleanliness, only to learn later it really had nothing to do with either Victorian England made that exact same assumption about lice, and it was just as wrong then as it usually is now? Treating an infestation meant long, tedious sessions with a fine-toothed comb, dragging it through section after section of hair to physically remove both the insects and the tiny eggs, cemented firmly to each strand, a chore that could easily consume an entire evening and gave English an idiom we still use today, going through something with a fine-tooth comb. Mothers performed this ritual by candlelight, working through a child's hair strand by strand, checking each pass against the light for anything moving. Some families turned to harsher measures out of sheer desperation, soaking the scalp in kerosene to suffocate the lice outright, a method that did work, though it came with its own very real risk of skin irritation, and given how flammable kerosene happens to be an entirely different kind of danger, sitting far too near an open household flame or a lit candle. Vinegar rinses were a gentler, more common approach, used to loosen the natural glue holding each egg to the hair shaft and make the whole tedious combing process at least slightly less impossible, even if it rarely solved the problem in a single sitting. While women were busy managing all of this on top of their heads, Victorian men were quietly having an entirely different kind of hair revolution, one that swept the country almost overnight. For much of the earlier part of the century, a clean-shaven face was the fashionable standard, with beards more commonly associated with eccentrics labourers, or men simply too poor to visit a barber regularly. Then, in the 1850s, soldiers returning home from the Crimean War brought with them thick, unshaven beards grown out of simple wartime necessity, in a climate where regular shaving was neither practical nor particularly appealing, and the public fell in love with the look almost immediately. Within a few short years, a full beard had transformed from an oddity into the very picture of respectable masculine strength. One popular book, published in 1854, devoted entirely to the philosophy of facial hair, argued in complete seriousness that a bare chin signalled weakness, and even a kind of moral softness in a man, while a proper beard stood as visible proof of vigour, discipline and character. Soon enough, judges, clergymen and even members of Parliament were sporting beards that would have seemed shockingly unkempt to their own fathers just a generation earlier. And here is where this story quietly loops all the way back to something we discussed in our very first hour together tonight. Some Victorian doctors, still operating under the old belief that disease travelled through foul air, actually recommended growing a full beard specifically as a health precaution, theorising that all that thick facial hair might physically filter dangerous particles out of every breath a man took before they ever reached his lungs. The same flawed thinking that once had Parliament soaking curtains in chloride of lime to fight a smell also quite sincerely talked half the men in England into growing beards as a kind of walking air filter, standing guard over their own lungs. It is almost impossible not to smile at that, once you notice the pattern repeating itself in such a completely different corner of the same story. A whole nation of gentlemen unknowingly wearing a monument to a medical theory that had already been proven wrong. There was money to be made from hair in one more direction, too quite separate from wigs and mourning jewellery. Advertisements throughout Victorian newspapers promised miracle tonics, capable of restoring thinning hair, banishing premature grey, or encouraging thicker growth almost overnight. Each one bottled with a confident label and an equally confident, entirely unverified claim, sold alongside every other patent remedy. We have already met tonight tucked onto the very same crowded pharmacy shelf as a soothing syrup or a jar of arsenic wafers. Ingredients varied wildly from one bottle to the next, sometimes harmless, sometimes considerably less so, and effectiveness rarely matched the promises printed so boldly on the label. A man worried about a receding hairline had in practice almost no reliable way to tell a genuine remedy, apart from an expensive bottle of coloured water, and precious few of these products ever bothered to prove the difference. It is perhaps the least surprising detail in this entire story. Any era anxious enough about hair to trade in the stuff internationally, weave it into jewellery and wage a lifelong war against its smallest unwelcome tenants, was always going to be an era willing to buy a bottle promising to grow more of it, whether or not the bottle could actually deliver on that promise. What strikes me pulling all of this together is just how much weight a person's hair was somehow expected to carry during this particular century. It announced your class and your moral character. It could be harvested, sold, and shipped across borders like any other cash crop. It was woven into jewellery to keep grief near the skin. It hosted invisible tenants that refused to respect a single social boundary anyone tried to draw around them. And on a man's face it was even pressed into service as imaginary armour against a disease nobody yet properly understood. Something so ordinary sitting quietly on every single head in the country, and somehow it never once stopped being asked to mean something far larger than itself, a stand-in for status, grief, health and virtue, all rolled into a few inches of keratin, most of us barely think twice about today. But if hair could be woven into mourning jewellery the moment someone died, that only hints at how seriously and how elaborately this entire era treated death itself. A single lock of hair kept and shaped and worn was really only the smallest visible fragment of an enormous private ceremony that followed every death in a Victorian household, one with its own strict rules, its own carefully choreographed rituals, and its own deeply human attempt to hold on to someone for just a little longer than the body itself was willing to allow. -E, let's step quietly into that ceremony now, because it deserves a gentle hand, the same gentle hand this whole subject actually received at the time. We have spent tonight moving through fear, poison, shame, and silence. But this next part of the story asks something a little different of us. It asks us to slow down. In a Victorian household, death rarely happened somewhere far away, tucked out of sight in an unfamiliar building. It happened at home, usually in the same bedroom where a person had slept for years surrounded by the people who loved them, and almost immediately afterward, before a single outside professional was ever called, the family itself, or more often the women of the family in the neighbourhood, took on the intimate task of preparing that body for its final rest. This task had a name, the laying out, and it followed a quiet, careful sequence passed down almost entirely through word of mouth, between women, rarely written down because it simply did not need to be. Neighbours and family often turned to one particular woman in the community frequently. The local midwife, the very same woman who had welcomed most of the local children into the world, now trusted to help see the departed safely out of it as well. A strange, quiet symmetry that must have shaped how she thought about her own life's work. The body was undressed and washed thoroughly from head to toe, a final act of tenderness as much as hygiene. Coins, often ordinary pennies, were placed gently over the closed eyelids to keep them shut. A cloth or bandage was tied beneath the jaw and looped over the crown of the head, holding the mouth closed until the muscles themselves had time to settle. Wrists, elbows, and ankles were bound loosely with strips of ribbon or soft fabric to keep the limbs lying straight, since a body left untended would otherwise stiffen into whatever position it happened to be resting in. One woman, recalling this custom decades later, put the underlying reason simply: you washed a person clean because you wanted them spotless for whatever waited on the other side. Almost every element of that ritual, when you actually sit with it, was really about controlling what the family could see and feel in a moment they otherwise had no power over at all. Grief strips away almost every ordinary choice a person gets to make. Washing, dressing, and carefully arranging a beloved body handed a devastated family something concrete to do with their hands and their attention, one final act of care they were still allowed to offer. The house itself changed too the moment death arrived. Clocks throughout the home were stopped at the exact hour of passing. their hands left frozen as a quiet marker of the moment, everything shifted a small, deliberate refusal to let ordinary time simply keep marching forward as though nothing had happened. Mirrors were covered with black cloth, or turned flat against the wall, out of an old folk belief that a spirit newly separated from its body might otherwise become trapped inside its own reflection, wandering lost between one world and the next. Have you ever caught your own reflection unexpectedly in a dark room and felt a small irrational jolt of unease? Multiply that instinct by an entire household already raw with grief, and the impulse to simply cover every mirror in the house starts to make a strange kind of emotional sense, whatever you make of the actual folklore behind it. A wreath woven from laurel or boxwood wrapped in black crepe was hung on the front door. Front, a wordless announcement to every neighbour and passer-by that this particular household was now in mourning, sparing the family from having to explain their loss to every visitor who happened by or from being caught off guard by a cheerful knock at the door on the very worst day they had ever faced. Now here is a detail that always catches people off guard a little. The body was rarely left alone, not even for a moment from the time of death until burial. Family and friends took turns sitting through the night beside it, a tradition we still call a wake today. Part of this was simple respect, a refusal to leave someone's remains unattended in their final hours above ground. But there was also something far more anxious sitting underneath that tradition, a very real, very widespread Victorian fear of being buried before you were actually dead. Medicine at the time could not always tell the difference between a deep coma and true death, with complete confidence, and stories, some true, many almost certainly exaggerated, circulated about coffins exhumed years later, revealing scratch marks on the inside lid. Newspapers occasionally reported cases of a person waking during their own funeral preparations, or worse, being formally pronounced dead only to stir again on the way to the cemetery, and whether every one of those stories held up under careful scrutiny mattered far less than how thoroughly they lodged themselves in the public imagination. Whether or not most of those stories held up under scrutiny, the fear itself was entirely real. Real enough that inventors patented so-called safety coffins fitted with a bell and a cord a supposedly deceased person could pull from inside the casket if they woke to find themselves buried alive, ringing an alarm above ground for someone to come dig them back up. Some designs went even further, including a small breathing tube running up through the soil to the surface, or a glass panel set into the coffin lid, so a watchman doing rounds through the cemetery at night could simply glance down and check for any sign of movement below. Few of these devices, it turns out, were ever actually needed, but their very existence, patented, manufactured, and purchased by anxious families, tells you everything you need to know about how seriously this fear was taken across the entire country. Can you imagine the particular flavour of dread that must have haunted a person lying in a sickbed, only half convinced their own family would notice the difference in time? Once burial finally arrived, even the day of the week carried meaning nobody bothered to write down on any official document, though everybody in a given town simply understood it anyway. Saturday belonged to the wealthy and well-connected, a funeral timed so mourners could attend without missing a day of work themselves. Sunday, by contrast, quietly became the day set aside for burying the poor, a small unspoken piece of the class divide we have circled back to so many times tonight, extending its reach right through to the very last appointment a person would ever keep. Not every custom from this chapter of Victorian life was quite so heavy, though. After the burial itself, mourners very often returned to the family home for a shared meal, frequently built around a cold joint of ham, a tradition sturdy and ordinary enough that it earned its own small affectionate saying at the time, referring to a properly respectful send-off as having buried someone with ham. There was something almost defiant about it. A room full of people freshly reminded of their own mortality, choosing to sit together over food and quiet conversation anyway. Grief, even at its most ritualized, still eventually needed a table, a shared plate, and the small practical comfort of feeding people who had spent an entire day standing in the cold. Mourning itself, once the burial had passed, became an entire structured system, with its own strict calendar and its own very specific wardrobe, one every respectable family was expected to understand without needing to ask. A widow was expected to wear deep matte black for roughly the first year of what was called full mourning. Dressed in a stiff, light, absorbing fabric called crepe that deliberately refused to shine or catch the light, before gradually easing into a period known as half mourning, where soft greys, lavenders and muted purples were finally permitted back into her closet. Jewellery during this period was almost always made from jet, a deep black polished stone, since anything bright or sparkling was considered wildly inappropriate for a woman still visibly grieving. Etiquette manuals of the period laid out the entire calendar in exacting detail, specifying almost to the week when a widow could trade crepe for silk, and when a piece of jet jewellery could finally give way to something with a bit more shine. The exact length of mourning shrank depending on how closely you were related to the person who had died, a distant cousin, earning only a few weeks of black clothing, a sibling, perhaps 6 months, while a widow might remain in some form of mourning dress for well over 2 years. Queen Victoria herself, as we touched on only a little while ago tonight, famously stretched her own mourning for her husband across the remaining decades of her entire life, turning personal grief into something that functioned almost like national fashion policy, with dressmakers across the country adjusting their entire business around what a queen in permanent black had made fashionable for everyone else. Managing all of this eventually became a proper profession in its own right. For much of the earlier part of the century, a simple coffin maker handled most of what a grieving family needed, a straightforward, largely unglamorous trade. By the Victorian period, that same trade had transformed into something far more elaborate professionals who called themselves funeral directors, offering horse-drawn hearses trimmed in black feathers, hired mourners to walk solemnly behind the procession, elaborate floral arrangements, and a full menu of services designed to turn grief into a properly staged public event, complete with pricing tiers not unlike anything else sold to Victorian consumers, only this time the customer was too devastated to negotiate. Public opinion toward these men, it must be said, was not always kind. Popular novelists of the era frequently painted undertakers as faintly sinister figures, quietly profiting from a family's rawest moment of vulnerability, exploiting guilt to sell an ever grander, ever more expensive send-off. The unspoken suggestion always hovering that the size of the funeral somehow reflected the size of the love that had been lost, whether or not the grieving family could actually afford it. There is one more custom from this era that tends to unsettle modern audiences more than almost anything else we've covered tonight, and I want to handle it with real care because underneath the strangeness sits something achingly human. Photography was still an expensive luxury for most Victorian families, and for many households the only photograph ever taken of a beloved child was taken after that child had already died. Photographers developed real skill at posing a small body to look peacefully asleep rather than gone, sometimes resting in a mother's arms, sometimes surrounded by a favourite toy, or seated gently among living siblings for one final family portrait, occasionally even with eyes gently painted open on the finished print, to soften the image further and make the child appear at a glance simply present rather than lost. Given how staggeringly high child mortality remained throughout this entire century, these portraits were often the single lasting image a family would ever hold of a child they had loved and buried far too soon. The only proof decades later that a particular small face had ever existed in the world at all. I understand why that practice can look strange, even a little disturbing from where we're sitting tonight so far, removed from a world where losing a child was tragically common, rather than a rare and singular horror. But I would ask you to consider it from a slightly different angle for just a moment. In a century that watched death visit almost every household, sometimes more than once, sometimes taking the very youngest members of the family before their first proper birthday, holding on to any lasting trace of a person you loved was not morbid at all. It was simply love refusing to let go completely, using whatever tools happened to be available at the time. If you've ever kept a voicemail from someone you lost just to hear their voice one more time, you already understand this custom better than you might think you do. What strikes me most sitting with this entire chapter is how loudly this era spoke about death compared to how quietly we tend to speak about it now. Clocks stopped, doors marked, bodies watched through the night, wardrobes rebuilt entirely around grief for years at a stretch. We have spent this whole evening together exploring an era terrified of invisible danger in water, in air, in unwashed hands, an era that flinched from naming so many ordinary bodily realities out loud. And yet when it came to the one certainty waiting for every single person in this story, rich or poor, this same anxious, secretive century somehow found the courage to look directly at it, name it, and build an entire structure of ritual around honouring it properly out in the open, without flinching, without euphemism. Maybe that is the real lesson tucked inside this particular chapter of the story. A society can be strangely brave about the one thing it cannot possibly avoid, death itself, while remaining almost entirely unable to speak plainly about the ordinary survivable realities of bathing, of periods of a crying infant, or of a doctor's own unwashed hands. We tend to assume shame and silence travel together in a straight line, quietly covering everything a culture finds uncomfortable in equal measure. The Victorians prove that assumption wrong. They stared straight at death, and gave it an entire elaborate dignified language of its own, while some of the smaller, more survivable truths of the body never even earned a polite word to describe them. But all of this quiet, careful ceremony around death was unfolding at the very same time an entirely different force was beginning to reshape everyday Victorian life for good, one built not around fear or superstition, but around science, finally catching up to instinct patient reformers who refused to give up, and a clever bar of soap that was about to change how an entire nation thought about cleanliness itself, right down to the bathroom sitting in your own home tonight. That bar of soap deserves a name because one particular man built an entire fortune on teaching Victorian England to actually want to be clean, rather than simply being frightened into it, which, if you think back across everything we have covered tonight, might be the single most radical idea in this entire story. His name was Thomas Barrett, and when he joined a small modest soap company through marriage into its owner's family in the 1860s, cleanliness was still tangled up in almost everything we have spent tonight, untangling fear of water, fear of bad air, shame, superstition, and a whole marketplace of confident men selling arsenic and opium with a perfectly straight face. Barrett looked at that same chaotic landscape and saw something nobody else quite had the nerve to try. He decided soap itself did not need fear to sell it. It needed beauty. In 1886, Barrett spotted a newspaper reproduction of a painting by one of England's most celebrated artists, a soft, gentle image of a small boy blowing soap bubbles, originally intended simply as a tender study of childhood innocence, nothing at all to do with cleaning products. Barrett paid the modern equivalent of a small fortune to secure the rights to that single image, quietly added a bar of his own soap into the corner of the picture, and turned it loose on every wall, magazine page and railway platform he could find space on. The painting had a real name once, but almost nobody today remembers it. Ask anyone what a Victorian soap advertisement looked like, and there is a very good chance the image sitting in their head, whether they know it or not, is that exact same little boy. The artist himself was not entirely comfortable with what had happened to his tender little portrait. Respected painters simply did not lend their work to advertising in this period, and critics openly mocked him for cheapening serious art in service of a bar of soap. One well-known novelist of the day publicly accused him of selling out his own talent for nothing more than commercial gain, a sharp public embarrassment for a man who had spent decades building a respected artistic reputation. He weathered the criticism anyway, and history quietly proved the trade worthwhile. That single image outlived nearly every objection raised against it, reproduced for well over a century afterward, recognized by people who have never once heard the artist's own name, let alone the name of the small grandson who posed for it, a boy who grew up entirely unrelated to soap to become a respected admiral in the Royal Navy. Barrett was only getting started, though. He is widely credited today as one of the true founders of modern advertising itself, and once you hear what he actually did, it becomes hard to argue with that title. He hired a glamorous, widely admired actress to appear in his advertisements, making her by most accounts the very first celebrity in history to endorse a commercial product for pay decades before anyone had a word for what we would now simply call a brand ambassador. He coined a cheerful little catchphrase, a simple morning greeting asking whether you'd used his soap, yet repeated so often and so widely that it outlived him by generations, printed on posters, painted onto walls, murmured half as a joke and half as genuine habit, in households that never once met the man behind it. In one particularly audacious stunt, he even had thousands of foreign coins stamped with his company's name and quietly slipped into circulation as a kind of guerrilla advertisement, a scheme so successful and so shameless that the government eventually had to step in and outlaw it entirely. An entire nation's pocket change briefly turned into a walking billboard before anyone in power noticed what was happening. Now be honest with me for a second. Does any of that sound like it came from 1886? Or does it sound suspiciously like a marketing meeting you could imagine happening this exact morning? What makes Barrett's story worth ending on tonight, though, is not simply the cleverness of his advertising. It is what he chose to sell alongside the soap itself. Think back for a moment to everything this particular kind of confident salesmanship has cost the people in tonight's story already. Madame Rachel promised imaginary Arabian secrets and quietly poisoned her wealthiest clients. Nameless chemists promised safe arsenic wafers and gentle morphine syrups, and buried more infants and hopeful young women than any of them ever bothered to count. Confidence dressed up in a fine label had already proven itself one of the most dangerous substances in this entire story again and again, long before Barrett ever bought a single painting. So it matters, I think, that Barrett built his own brand around a different kind of confidence entirely, a single, almost radical word: purity. He leaned directly into the very science this whole evening has watched, slowly, painfully earn its place: germ theory, careful hand-washing the idea that invisible causes deserved visible respect, the same hard-won understanding that cost Semmelweis his career and very nearly his life to establish. Soap was no longer sold as a vague old-fashioned virtue the way it had been marketed for generations before him. It was sold as a truly modern answer to a truly modern understanding of disease dressed up in a beautiful painting instead of a frightening warning label. For possibly the first time in this entire story, fear was not the primary thing being sold to Victorian households. Confidence for once actually happened to be pointing in the right direction. That same spirit of consolidation, taking decades of scattered hard-fought lessons and finally organising them into something whole, reached Parliament itself just a year before Barrett bought his famous painting. In 1875, an Act of Parliament brought together practically every scattered thread we have followed through this entire evening. Sewers, clean water waste disposal, safe food and proper housing standards into one single comprehensive national law, running well over 100 pages a length. That alone tells you just how enormous and how long neglected this entire problem had truly become. For the first time, every town and district in the country was legally required to appoint its own medical officer and its own sanitary inspector, real salaried positions, dedicated entirely to keeping ordinary people alive and well answerable, not to a distant government office, but to the very streets they were responsible for protecting. New homes could no longer legally be built without a proper connection to the sewer system, closing once and for all the loophole that had kept far too many households relying on an earth closet and a wooden bucket decades after London had already buried its own waste problem underground. It was not one dramatic breakthrough the way a single scalpel cut or a single bottle of chlorinated lime had been earlier tonight. It was the quiet, unglamorous stitching together of dozens of smaller victories we have spent this whole night with Kitty Wilkinson's borrowed boiler in a Liverpool cellar, Basil Get's sewers running silently beneath London streets, John Snow's careful hand-drawn map of a single contaminated pump, Semmelweis's chlorinated lime finally recognised as more than one stubborn man's obsession. To put the scale of the problem into a single number, historians estimate that one disease alone, tuberculosis, quietly spread through crowded, poorly ventilated housing, accounted for something near 1 out of every 3 deaths recorded across Victorian Britain at the century's midpoint. An entire national law built from decades of separate hard-won battles, fought by people who mostly never met one another, who rarely even knew the others existed, all quietly gathered up into a single piece of legislation and handed down to every town in the country, at once aimed squarely at numbers exactly that staggering. There is a small quiet detail sitting underneath this whole advertising story that I find strangely moving once you actually notice it. The soap itself. The plain, unremarkable product Barrett spent his entire career dressing up in fine art and celebrity endorsements still exists on shelves today, more than 2 centuries after it was first made, one of the oldest continuously registered brands in the entire world. Long after the arsenic wafers vanished, long after the mercury creams were finally pulled from every shelf, long after Madame Rachel's fraudulent Arabian miracles were exposed and forgotten, one honest bar of soap marketed with nothing more dramatic than a painting of a child and a cheerful morning greeting simply kept doing exactly what it promised to do. Sometimes it turns out the quiet, unglamorous truth truly does outlast every louder, more dazzling lie standing next to it. I keep returning as this evening winds down to how much courage this whole story actually required, and how rarely that courage looked the way we expect courage to look. It rarely wore a uniform or carried a sword. Sometimes it looked like a washerwoman opening her own cellar to a frightened street. Sometimes it looked like a stubborn, difficult Hungarian doctor alienating every colleague he had left rather than stop insisting he was right. Sometimes it looked like a nurse armed with nothing more than a hand-drawn chart, or a plumber willing to write furious letters to the very officials who could ruin his business. And sometimes this part always surprises people a little. It looked like an advertising man with a talent for theft dressed up as flattery, quietly normalizing good habits because good habits happen to be excellent for business. Think back for just a moment across everything we have walked through together tonight. The fear of a smell that turned out to hide something worse than anyone imagined. The bathwater families were too afraid to use, and the wealthy few determined to soak in it anyway as medicine. The corset debate that refused to be either myth or monster, only ever the messy, complicated truth in between. The arsenic wafers eaten in pursuit of paleness, and the opium quietly poured into a hungry family's only chance at a wage. The silence surrounding a woman's own body matched almost exactly by the silence surrounding everybody's own bathroom. The hair sold, woven and fought over. The dead washed, watched and photographed with a tenderness that still catches in the throat a little even now. Each one of those stories on its own might look like nothing more than a strange, occasionally horrifying curiosity from a distant century. Laid side by side like this, across a single long evening together, they start to look like something else entirely. The honest, unfiltered record of how difficult it has always been for ordinary people to simply stay clean, stay healthy and stay alive. None of them set out to build the world surrounding you tonight. And yet somewhere between a borrowed boiler in Liverpool and a smiling child selling soap that is exactly what they built, one stubborn, unglamorous decision at a time, none of them working from any grand master plan, none of them able to see how their own small piece would eventually connect to all the others. So here is where I want to leave you on this particular night. The next time you turn on a tap without a second thought, or flush a toilet without flinching, or reach for a bar of soap without wondering whether it might poison you, you are quietly living inside the finished argument of everyone we met tonight. The frightened parliament soaking curtains in chemicals, the mother pressing rags to a child's forehead, terrified of an air she could not see, the washerwoman with a single boiler and a spare afternoon deciding her whole street mattered more than her own comfort. The stubborn doctor nobody wanted to believe right about everything except how to make anyone listen. All of it, every strange and painful and occasionally beautiful piece of it, quietly built the ordinary, unremarkable comfort sitting all around you right now. So ordinary that most of us will fall asleep tonight without giving any of it a second thought at all. Perhaps, after tonight, you might give it one. Thank you for spending this evening with me, walking through all of it together, one strange and human piece at a time. We started tonight inside a smell so thick it brought a government to its knees, and somehow, hours later, we have ended here beside a single painted child and a bar of soap that outlived every scandal thrown at it. That is quite a distance to travel together in one sitting, and I'm grateful you chose to spend it here rather than anywhere else tonight. If any part of this story stayed with you, a name you'd never heard before, a fact you find yourself wanting to repeat to a friend later, or simply the strange comfort of realizing how many ordinary unnamed people quietly built the safe, clean world you're resting in right now, then this evening has already done exactly what I hoped it would do. If tonight's story kept you company, made you a little more curious about the world, or simply helped you drift off somewhere along the way, that is truly all I could ever ask for. Shut your eyes now if they are not shut already. Let the room go quiet and let everything we have talked about tonight settle gently into the back of your mind the way a good story always should. Rest well tonight. There is always another story waiting. Another door in another century I would love to open with you, and I will be right here whenever you're ready to come find me again.